You're in the wrong section, son. The words cut through the polished silence of first class, like a blade. Patricia Hawkins stood in the aisle of Flight 847, her silver hair pinned into a perfect chignon. 25 years of flying, teaching her to spot trouble before it settled into premium leather seats. Marcus Rivera, 16 shoulders squared and head high, paused. His dark skin caught the cabin's warm lighting as he checked his boarding pass 1B. Window seat first class, exactly where he belonged. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the familiar weight of having to prove he deserved space he'd already paid for. "This is my seat," he said simply, voice steadier than his racing heart. Patricia had already made her assessment. Worn backpack sneakers that had seen better days, hoodie beneath a button-down shirt. In her world, first-class passengers wore suits and carried leather briefcases. They didn't look like this. Before we continue this story that shocked the aviation industry, put yourself in Marcus's position. You're 16, flying alone, and an adult authority figure is questioning your right to exist in a space you belong. How would you feel? Drop a comment below, and if you believe every passenger deserves dignity, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will change how you see airline travel forever. Behind Marcus, business travelers shuffled past with practiced indifference. The woman in 2A buried herself in her magazine. The man in 3C stared out the window. No one looked directly, but everyone listened to the familiar rhythm of discrimination, disguised as customer service. Patricia's smile never wavered, warm enough to avoid complaints, cold enough to maintain authority. "I'm sure there's been confusion with your ticket. Let me take a look." Marcus handed over his boarding pass without hesitation, though his stomach knotted with the knowledge that this simple act shouldn't feel like surrender. Patricia examined it theatrically, checking corners as if looking for forgery. Her tablet showed Marcus Rivera, seat 1B. First class confirmed. But sometimes she thought the system made mistakes. "This is unusual," she murmured loud enough for nearby passengers. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes." Marcus's voice carried a weariness that seemed too old for his 16 years. "And you're how old?" 16. Patricia's eyebrows rose. "Quite young for first class alone. Is there an adult meeting you?" Marcus shifted his backpack, feeling the weight of 37 pairs of eyes judging whether he belonged in their exclusive bubble. "I don't need an adult. I have a valid ticket." "Of course," Patricia said, her tone suggesting otherwise. "We have procedures, security protocols. I'm sure you understand." She didn't explain what protocols required interrogating a passenger who'd already passed security and gate verification. Everyone in first class understood the real protocol: maintain the atmosphere. Keep the riffraff out. Preserve the illusion that expensive seats could buy distance from people like him. The woman in 2A looked up, not at Marcus, but at Patricia, offering a small nod of encouragement. The gesture said, "Everything, handle this quietly, efficiently, and we'll all pretend it never happened." Marcus pulled out his phone, not to record or take pictures, but because holding it gave his shaking hands something to do. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Sir, put that away. Cell phones should be in airplane mode." "We haven't started taxiing," Marcus replied, thumb hovering over his father's contact. "And you haven't explained why I can't sit in my assigned seat." Silence, except for distant air conditioning. Patricia felt watching eyes, expectation of resolution. She wore the uniform, carried the authority, had the power to restore order to their carefully segregated world. "Young man," she stepped closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that carried perfectly through the quiet cabin. "I'm trying to help you avoid embarrassment. This section is for premium passengers who paid premium prices. I'm sure there's been some mistake." Marcus looked at her steadily, seeing not just Patricia, but every adult who'd ever made him feel small for existing in spaces they thought belonged to them. There's no mistake. My father purchased this ticket. Your father. The words sounded suspicious, loaded with assumptions about what kind of father a boy like this could have. And what does your father do? The question hung like smoke. Marcus could have said David Rivera, CEO and majority owner of Skyline Airways, the very airline they were flying. Could have mentioned the 45% stake, the corner office, the direct line to the executive suite that would make Patricia's blood freeze. Instead, he chose dignity over intimidation. He works in aviation. Patricia's smile turned predatory. Aviation could mean baggage handler, maintenance worker, security guard, employee discounts, friend of a friend deals, charity upgrades. Not the kind who belonged in first class with their kind. I see. Well, I'm sure your father did his best. But sometimes these employee perks get complicated. Why don't we find you a lovely spot in our main cabin? More appropriate for someone your age. The insult landed with surgical precision, delivered with such professional courtesy that it took a moment to fully register. Even business travelers stopped pretending to ignore the situation. This wasn't just about seating assignments. This was about knowing your place in the natural order. Marcus stood perfectly still, thinking about his father's morning words. You don't have to prove you belong anywhere, son. You just have to refuse to accept that you don't. But refusing felt harder when you were alone, surrounded by silence, carrying the weight of every assumption about who you were, based on how you looked. I'm staying in my seat, he said, voice quiet, but unbreakable. Excuse me, seat 1B. It's mine. I'm not moving. The woman in 2A made a soft sound of disapproval. Others shifted uncomfortably. This was supposed to be handled quietly, diplomatically. The boy was supposed to understand and comply gracefully. Patricia felt the familiar surge of authority that came with uniform and rank. 25 years had taught her that firmness consistently applied solved most problems. People needed to understand their place, especially people who tried to rise above it. Son, you can move to economy voluntarily, or I can have security escort you. Those are your options. Marcus stepped toward his seat, each movement deliberate, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Patricia's hand shot out, stopping him mid-motion. I don't think you heard me. I heard you perfectly, Marcus replied, looking around the cabin at faces that had become studies in calculated indifference. You told me I don't belong here because of how I look, because my father works in aviation instead of owning the company, because someone like me couldn't possibly afford to sit next to someone like them. Patricia's face flushed red, professional mask slipping for the first time. That is not what I said. It's exactly what you said. You just used nicer words. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Patricia needed to end this decisively before other passengers started questioning the comfortable segregation that made their premium experience possible. She reached for Marcus's phone, intending to confiscate what she saw as a tool of disruption. As her fingers closed around the device, Marcus pulled back instinctively, not aggressively, just protectively, and Patricia's palm connected with his cheek, with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute and damning. Marcus stood perfectly still, cheek reddening from impact, phone clutched in hand. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout or curse or threaten. He simply looked at Patricia with eyes that had suddenly aged beyond his 16 years, processing the familiar sting of being reduced to his skin color by someone who'd never see him as fully human. Then he turned and walked toward the back of the plane. Every passenger watched him go. Some looked ashamed, others satisfied. All looked away when he met their eyes, unable to hold his gaze, while their silence echoed louder than any scream. As Marcus settled into seat 32F, middle seat, no window next to the bathroom, he pulled out his phone with hands that shook not from fear, but from contained fury. He opened his messages and stared at his father's contact for a long moment, knowing these next words would change everything. She slapped me. "Seat 1B to 32F. He attached a photo of his boarding pass, hit send, and leaned back against the thin headrest. Around him, economy passengers boarded with their rolling bags and crumpled boarding passes, squeezing into seats that cost a fraction of what his father had paid for 1B. But Marcus wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about dignity, how it couldn't be purchased, or confiscated, or slapped away, even when the whole world conspired to make you forget you had any right to it at all. And he was thinking about what would happen when David Rivera read those 7 words. The sound reverberated through first class, like a bell tolling the end of comfortable complicity. In the aftermath, silence so complete that the air conditioning seemed to roar like a hurricane. Passengers froze coffee cups, suspended halfway to lips magazines, held at impossible angles, reading glasses, sliding down noses, as heads turned toward the scene they could no longer pretend to ignore. Jennifer Torres stood at the galley, with welcome champagne mouth slightly open in shock. In 3 years with Skyline Airways, she'd witnessed disputes, emergencies, even a small cargo fire. But she'd never seen crew strike a passenger. The training was crystal clear, no physical contact except for immediate safety threats. A 16-year-old asking to sit in his assigned seat didn't constitute a safety threat. Patricia herself seemed stunned by her own actions, as if her hand had moved independently of her conscious mind. The righteous authority that had driven her behavior was already cracking, replaced by the dawning realization that she may have crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But it was too late for second-guessing. The deed was witnessed by 37 passengers and captured on at least 2 cell phones. Robert Chen in 2A had been recording since the confrontation began, his journalist instincts recognizing the makings of a story that would define careers and reshape industries. When Patricia's hand connected with Marcus's cheek, Chen knew he was documenting a watershed moment in American civil rights. Think about what you just witnessed: a grown woman slapping a child for trying to sit in his assigned seat. If you think this moment changed everything, wait until you see what happens next. Put yourself in Marcus's shoes. How would you respond? Comment below and subscribe, because this teenager's response will inspire you. Marcus walked past Chen's row with his head held high, expression unreadable, but eyes carrying something that made seasoned business travelers look away in shame. Chen caught something in those eyes, not defeat, but calculation. This wasn't a broken child accepting humiliation. This was someone who understood exactly what had just happened and was already thinking 3 steps ahead. As Marcus disappeared toward the back, Patricia attempted to restore normalcy to the cabin. She smoothed her uniform, checked her appearance in an overhead compartment reflection, and began her standard pre-flight announcements, as if striking a minor passenger was just another item on her customer service checklist. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Skyline Airways Flight 847 to New York LaGuardia. Her voice carried its usual professional warmth, but several passengers noticed the slight tremor beneath the practiced calm. Jennifer Torres, still holding her tray of champagne, caught Patricia's eye and gestured toward the back with a questioning look. Patricia shook her head sharply. Matter closed, not to be discussed. But the matter was far from closed. In seat 32F, squeezed between a nervous flyer clutching a paperback novel and a businessman already typing furiously on his laptop, Marcus composed what would become the most important text message in aviation history. The words came to him without drama or embellishment, just raw truth distilled to its essence. She slapped me. Seat 1B to 32F. He attached the photo of his boarding pass, showing his original seat assignment, then scrolled to find the contact listed simply as Dad. Marcus had dozens of ways to reach his father office line executive assistant, emergency contact, even a direct line to the corporate jet. But the cell number was the most personal, reserved for family conversations and midnight check-ins from business trips. As his thumb hovered over send, Marcus whispered to himself, "Dad, I hope you know what you're doing." Because he understood his father well enough to know that David Rivera's response to threats against his family was swift, comprehensive, and utterly unforgiving. Patricia Hawkins was about to become an obstacle that needed removing. Marcus pressed send. The message traveled through cellular towers and data networks, crossing state lines in milliseconds to reach a glass tower in downtown Atlanta, where David Rivera sat in a mahogany-paneled boardroom reviewing quarterly reports with Skyline Airways' senior executive team. The phone buzzed against the polished conference table. Rivera glanced at the screen, saw his son's name, and felt the familiar warmth that came with messages from home. Marcus was flying to New York for college visits, early admission interviews at Columbia and NYU, a proud father's investment in his son's future. Rivera expected a routine travel update. Instead, he read 7 words that made his corporate composure evaporate like morning mist. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Rivera's expression shifted from paternal interest to something much colder, more dangerous. His hand shook as he processed the implications not from fear, but from the kind of controlled rage that comes when someone hurts your child. The 16-year-old boy who still asked for bedtime stories, who called when math homework got difficult, who trusted his father to make the world safe, that boy had just been assaulted on Rivera's own airline. The CEO disappeared. Only the father remained. Around the conference table, senior vice presidents continued their presentations, unaware that the man controlling 45% of their company's stock had just declared war on his own employee. Rivera stood slowly, his movement causing conversations to falter and die. "Excuse me," he said, voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to command absolute attention. "I need to make a phone call. Put yourself in David Rivera's position. Someone just assaulted your child on your own airline, and you have the power to ground every plane in the sky. What's your first move? Comment your response below and subscribe, because this CEO's reaction will shock you." Sarah Goldberg, Chief Operations Officer, looked up from her presentation slides. "Sir, should we continue the quarterly review?" Rivera's smile was thin as a blade carrying the promise of consequences that would reshape careers and redefine industry standards. "No, Sarah. We have a more immediate problem to address." He walked to the window overlooking downtown Atlanta, phone already dialing the operations center. Below, afternoon traffic crawled through city streets like blood cells through arteries. Ordinary people going about their daily routines, unaware that somewhere above their heads, a decision was being made that would fundamentally alter how an entire industry thought about customer service. The call was answered on the first ring. "Operations. This is Martinez." "Martinez, this is David Rivera. Ground flight 847 immediately." There was a pause, the sound of computer keys clicking rapidly, as the operations manager processed an order unlike any he'd received in 15 years of airline operations. "Sir, Flight 847 is currently at the gate in Los Angeles, preparing for LaGuardia departure. Is there a mechanical issue? Security concern?" Rivera's voice dropped to a register that made the conference room windows seem to vibrate with barely contained fury. "There's a crew discipline issue requiring immediate attention. The flight does not take off until I personally authorize it. Is that understood?" Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, can you provide more details? The FAA will require documentation for any delay. The documentation will be provided." Rivera said, each word carefully controlled. "Right now, I need your absolute guarantee that Flight 847 remains at the gate." "Yes, sir. Flight 847 is grounded until further notice. Rivera ended the call and turned back to his executive team, who were watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed panic. Sarah Goldberg had worked with Rivera for 8 years and had never seen him exercise this kind of direct operational control. Something significant was happening, something that required the CEO's personal intervention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rivera said, his voice returning to its normal conversational tone, but carrying an undertone of steel. "We're adjusting today's agenda. Sarah, contact our legal department for a comprehensive review of crew conduct policies." Maria arranged for the corporate jet to be ready for immediate departure to Los Angeles. Maria Santos, Rivera's executive assistant, was already taking notes with the efficiency that came from years of managing crises. "Should I arrange hotel accommodations in Los Angeles, sir?" "That won't be necessary," Rivera replied. "This will be resolved today." The executives exchanged meaningful glances. Rivera was known for his strategic thinking and measured responses to corporate challenges. This level of immediate personal involvement suggested something far more serious than routine operational issues. David, Sarah said, carefully choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood she was walking into a minefield. "Can you tell us what's happening?" Rivera picked up his phone and showed them the screen, Marcus's message displayed in stark black text against the white background. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Not just the personal violation against Rivera's son, but the potential legal and public relations catastrophe facing their company. "A crew member just assaulted my 16-year-old son, Rivera," said matter-of-factly, his corporate training warring with paternal fury. "She removed him from his first-class seat, based solely on appearance, then struck him when he refused to abandon his assigned seating." Multiple witnesses, likely recorded by passengers. The silence stretched until Sarah found her voice. "Jesus Christ, David. I'm so sorry. Is Marcus okay?" "Marcus is handling this with more dignity than the adult who attacked him," Rivera replied, his expression hardening into something that made veteran executives shift uncomfortably in their chairs. But Skyline Airways is about to face a reckoning that will redefine how this industry approaches customer service and civil rights. He activated the room's video conferencing system with movements that seemed almost casual, but everyone in the room recognized the deliberate calm that preceded corporate executions. Within seconds, Captain Frank Muller's face appeared on screen, expression tense and confused. Behind him, Flight 847's cockpit was visible instruments, glowing pre-flight checklists completed, ready for a departure that would never come. Captain Mueller Rivera said, "I understand you've received orders to remain at the gate." "Yes, sir. Operations says there's a crew discipline issue, but they haven't provided specifics. My passengers are getting restless, and LAX is asking for our departure slot." Rivera leaned forward, his hands flat on the conference table. "Captain, I need you to bring your head flight attendant to the cockpit immediately, Patricia Hawkins. She's about to have a very difficult conversation." Muller's weathered face showed surprise. In 30 years of flying commercial aircraft, he'd never been asked to facilitate crew discipline during active boarding operations. "Sir, is this about a passenger complaint?" Rivera's smile was cold enough to frost the video screen. "This is about assault, Captain. Ms. Hawkins struck a passenger, a minor, and removed him from his assigned seat based on discriminatory profiling. I need her in your cockpit now, so we can address this situation before it escalates beyond our ability to control." The blood drained from Muller's face as he processed the implications. Passenger assault allegations were career-ending events that typically involved federal law enforcement, congressional investigations, and industry-wide reforms. If what Rivera was saying was true, Flight 847 had become the epicenter of a crisis that would ripple through aviation for years to come. "I'll bring her up immediately, sir." As the video call ended, Rivera turned back to his team, who were staring at the flight tracking monitor displaying Flight 847, as a motionless red dot at LAX. None of them had ever witnessed their CEO exercise this kind of direct personal intervention in operational matters. They were about to learn that attacking David Rivera's son was the fastest way to discover exactly how much power a motivated airline executive could wield when family honor was at stake. The boardroom transformed from a routine quarterly review into a war room within minutes of David Rivera reading his son's message. The mahogany table, previously cluttered with financial reports and presentation binders, now served as command central for what Rivera's executive team was beginning to understand would be the most significant crisis in the company's 40-year history. Sarah Goldberg stood at the wall-mounted monitors, displaying real-time flight tracking data. Flight 847 appeared as a stationary red dot at Los Angeles International Airport, surrounded by dozens of moving aircraft preparing for departure. The plane should have been airborne 15 minutes ago, but Rivera's ground order had frozen it at Gate 42, like a chess piece awaiting its owner's next strategic move. Legal is on line 3, Maria Santos announced, phone pressed to her ear while balancing a tablet displaying the company's executive contact directory. Insurance wants a preliminary incident report within the hour, and I have the Department of Transportation holding on line 1. Rivera nodded without looking away from his own phone, where he was reviewing a series of follow-up messages from Marcus that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of institutional bias disguised as customer service. The flight attendant's name witness information, even a photo of his original boarding pass that Patricia Hawkins had deemed inappropriate for a black teenager. But it was the final message that made Rivera's jaw clench with barely controlled fury. Dad, other passengers recorded it. This is going to be everywhere. Imagine being this CEO. Your son was just assaulted on your own airline. It's recorded, and it's about to go viral worldwide. Most executives would panic. Rivera. He saw an opportunity. Put yourself in his shoes. Would you try to cover it up or expose everything? Comment your strategy below and subscribe, because what happens next is a masterclass in crisis management. Sarah Rivera said, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the conference room. I need you to understand something. This isn't just about one employee's misconduct. This is about institutional failure at every level of our operation. A passenger was profiled, assaulted, and humiliated, while 37 witnesses sat in silence. That tells me we have cultural problems that go deeper than one rogue flight attendant. Goldberg looked up from her monitoring station. Her years of experience in airline operations, helping her recognize the difference between routine customer service failures and industry-defining scandals. This incident had all the components of a perfect storm. Clear video evidence, racial discrimination, corporate negligence, and a victim with both moral authority and access to unlimited legal resources. David, what's our immediate priority? Damage control or accountability? Rivera's smile carried the kind of dangerous satisfaction that came from finally having an excuse to address problems he'd suspected for years. Both Sarah. We're going to demonstrate that Skyline Airways takes discrimination seriously by investigating this incident transparently and thoroughly. But we're also going to make it clear that this behavior is unacceptable and will have consequences severe enough to deter future incidents across the entire industry. He activated the room's secure communication system and placed a call to Captain Frank Mueller's cockpit. The connection crackled to life with the background noise of aircraft engines and air traffic control communications that seemed almost mundane compared to the corporate warfare about to unfold. Captain Mueller. This is David Rivera. What's the status of Patricia Hawkins? Sir, I've called her to the cockpit as requested. She's very nervous. Claims this is all a misunderstanding about seat assignments and customer service protocols. Rivera's laugh was cold enough to frost the Atlanta conference room windows. Captain, I'm going to share some information with you, and I want you to repeat it verbatim to Ms. Hawkins. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Tell her that Marcus Rivera, the passenger she assaulted, is my son. Tell her that multiple passengers recorded her actions. Tell her that those recordings are already being reviewed by our legal department and will shortly be in the hands of federal investigators. And tell her that her employment with Skyline Airways ended the moment she decided that a black teenager couldn't possibly belong in first class. The silence from the cockpit stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Captain Muller's voice returned shaky and subdued. Sir, she's asking if there's any way to resolve this privately. She says she was just following security protocols. Rivera's hand trembled, not with fear, but with the effort required to contain 20 years of suppressed rage at a system that had made his son's humiliation seem routine to the people who witnessed it. Security protocols that require assaulting minors. Captain. Security protocols that authorize crew members to remove passengers from paid seats based on their appearance. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Tell Ms. Hawkins that the only resolution I'm interested in is ensuring that no other family experiences what mine did today. And tell her that her attempts to justify assault as security procedure are being recorded for federal investigators. Patricia Hawkins just tried to justify slapping a child as security protocol. If you think that excuse is insulting to every legitimate security professional, comment, "No excuse," below. And subscribe because Rivera's response is about to redefine accountability in corporate America. As the call continued, Rivera's executive team worked frantically to assess the scope of the crisis they were facing. Maria Santos had assembled a preliminary timeline showing that the incident occurred during boarding, lasted approximately 12 minutes, and was witnessed by passengers throughout the first-class cabin. Initial social media monitoring showed no viral videos yet, but their communications director estimated they had hours, not days, before this became a national story. Sir Sarah Goldberg interrupted, looking up from her tablet with an expression of barely controlled panic. I've been reviewing passenger manifests for Flight 847. We have some high-profile travelers in first class, a federal judge, 2 Fortune 500 executives, and a technology journalist who has over 3 million social media followers. If any of them recorded the incident. Rivera nodded grimly, his strategic mind already calculating the implications. Then we have hours, not days, before this becomes the lead story on every news network in America, which means we need to get ahead of it immediately with our own narrative. He returned to his communication with Captain Muller, his voice taking on the tone of a general issuing battlefield orders. Captain, I'm going to give you very specific instructions, and I need you to follow them exactly. First, Patricia Hawkins is to be escorted from the aircraft by airport security and detained pending federal investigation. Second, you are to make an announcement to all passengers explaining that the flight has been delayed due to a crew conduct investigation. Third, you are to ensure that my son is returned to his original seat in first class and provided with any assistance he requires. Sir Captain Muller said carefully, his 30 years of experience telling him that this conversation would be recorded and reviewed by federal investigators. Ms. Hawkins is claiming that your son was disruptive and threatening. She says the physical contact was defensive in nature. The temperature in the Atlanta boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees as Rivera processed what was clearly a false accusation, designed to justify the unjustifiable. His executive team stopped their conversations and turned to watch their CEO's reaction to hearing his 16-year-old son characterized as a threat requiring physical force to contain. Captain Muller Rivera said, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded corporate executions. I want you to look at Patricia Hawkins and deliver a message from me personally. Tell her that lying about my son's conduct is the second worst decision she could make today. The worst decision would be continuing to lie when federal investigators begin their interviews in approximately 20 minutes. Rivera paused, letting the implications sink in while every person in the room held their breath. And Captain, I want you to make it clear to Ms. Hawkins that her actions have consequences beyond her own employment. Every crew member who witnessed this incident and failed to intervene is now subject to review. Every supervisor who trained her is being investigated. Every policy that allowed this to happen is being rewritten. She didn't just assault my son. She exposed systematic failures that are going to cost this company millions of dollars and dozens of careers. The silence from the cockpit was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft communication systems. When Captain Muller finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the background noise. "Sir, she's crying. Says she never meant for this to happen." Rivera stood and walked to the conference room windows looking out over the Atlanta skyline, where thousands of people were going about their daily routines, unaware that their understanding of airline customer service was about to be fundamentally altered by one teenager's refusal to accept injustice, quietly. Captain intent doesn't matter when the action is assault. Patricia Hawkins intended to maintain what she saw as appropriate first-class demographics. She intended to put a black teenager in his place. She intended to demonstrate her authority over someone she deemed inferior. The fact that she's now crying about the consequences doesn't change the calculated cruelty of her original intentions. Here's the brutal truth. Rivera just revealed. Patricia's tears aren't about remorse, they're about consequences. She was fine with humiliating a child until she realized it might cost her career. If you think crying doesn't excuse assault, comment. Tears don't excuse assault, and subscribe, because accountability is coming. Rivera turned back to his executive team, who were hanging on every word of what they understood was a defining moment in their company's history. This wasn't just about disciplining one employee. This was about sending a message to every airline worker in America about the cost of discriminatory behavior. Sarah, I want you to draft a company-wide memo that will be distributed within the hour. Every Skyline Airways employee, from pilots to baggage handlers, needs to understand that discrimination of any kind will result in immediate termination and federal prosecution. No warnings, no second chances, no sensitivity training sessions. Zero tolerance means zero tolerance. Goldberg was already typing furiously on her laptop. David, the union is going to fight this. Patricia Hawkins has 25 years of service and a clean disciplinary record. They'll argue for progressive discipline and due process. Rivera's smile was predatory, carrying the promise of a battle he was eager to fight. Let them argue, Sarah. We have video evidence of a crew member assaulting a minor passenger. The union can explain to their membership why they're defending someone who makes their entire profession look like a collection of racist thugs who can't distinguish between customer service and hate crimes. He returned to his communication with Captain Muller, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone creating an official record. Captain, I need you to understand something that I want clearly documented. This incident is going to be investigated by the FBI, the Department of Transportation, and probably Congress. Your crew's handling of the next few hours will determine whether they're viewed as professional aviators who took swift corrective action or as complicit bystanders who enabled discrimination to flourish on their aircraft. I suggest you make that choice clear to them. Yes, sir. What should I tell the passengers about the delay? Rivera considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would be scrutinized by federal investigators, congressional committees, and millions of social media users. Transparency was risky. Admitting to passenger assault would trigger immediate media attention and potential lawsuits. But covering it up was worse, especially with multiple witnesses and video recordings already in circulation. Tell them the truth, Captain. Tell them that a crew member violated company policy and federal law by discriminating against a passenger, and that Skyline Airways is taking immediate action to address the situation. Tell them that we apologize for the delay and will be providing compensation for their inconvenience. And tell them that they are witnessing Skyline Airways' commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The announcement would be unprecedented in airline history, a public admission of crew misconduct, while the incident was still being investigated. But Rivera understood that the traditional strategy of denial and delay wouldn't work in an era of viral videos and social media outrage. Better to control the narrative from the beginning than spend months defending the indefensible. Captain Mueller, I'm going to ask you one final question, and I want a completely honest answer. Did any other crew members witness the assault on my son? Another long pause filled with the weight of careers hanging in the balance. Sir, the junior flight attendant Jennifer Torres saw everything. And I think some of the other passengers might have intervened if the situation had continued to escalate. Rivera felt a spark of satisfaction amid the fury. At least one crew member had maintained her professional standards, and passenger intervention suggested that the moral bankruptcy wasn't universal. Those details would be important when the inevitable investigations began, and Congress started asking why an entire cabin of adults had remained silent while a child was assaulted. Make sure Ms. Torres understands that her cooperation with investigators will be noted positively in her personnel file. And Captain, I want you to personally escort my son back to seat 1B, not because he needs special treatment, but because it's his seat, and he should never have been removed from it in the first place. As the call ended, Rivera surveyed his executive team, who were processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. In 30 minutes, their CEO had dismantled a 25-year employee, initiated a federal investigation, and committed the company to a level of transparency that would either demonstrate moral leadership or expose them to catastrophic legal liability. Ladies and gentlemen, Rivera said, straightening his tie and checking his watch with the precision of a general preparing for battle. We have approximately 6 hours before this story dominates every major news outlet in America. I suggest we use that time to ensure that when the public examines our response, they see a company that values human dignity above corporate convenience. Sarah Goldberg looked up from her laptop, her fingers still flying across the keyboard as she tried to keep pace with the crisis unfolding around them. David, are you sure about this approach? We could contain this, quietly handle it through internal channels, avoid the media circus. Rivera picked up his phone and looked at his son's messages one more time. 7 words that had exposed decades of institutional racism, hiding behind professional courtesy and customer service protocols. Sarah, my son sent me a text message because he trusted that his father would do the right thing. I'm not going to quietly contain an assault. I'm going to make sure it never happens again to any passenger on any airline. He moved toward the conference room door, pausing at the threshold to address his team one final time with words that would be quoted in business schools for decades to come. The corporate jet will be ready in 20 minutes. I'm flying to Los Angeles to personally ensure that Flight 847 is handled appropriately. While I'm gone, I want every department head to review their procedures for potential discriminatory practices. If we're going to transform this industry, we're starting with our own company today. As Rivera left the boardroom, his executive team remained behind, staring at the flight tracking monitor, where Flight 847 continued to sit motionless at Gate 42. None of them had ever witnessed their CEO exercise this kind of direct, personal intervention in operational matters. They were about to learn that attacking David Rivera's son was the fastest way to discover exactly how much power a motivated airline executive could wield when institutional change became personal. Captain Frank Mueller had weathered everything from engine failures over the Atlantic Ocean to unruly passengers threatening flight security during post-9/11 tensions. But as he stared at the secure communication screen showing David Rivera's face, he realized that none of his 3 decades of experience had prepared him for the conversation he was about to facilitate. Patricia Hawkins stood behind him in the cramped cockpit, her usual composure completely shattered. The woman who had projected absolute authority just an hour earlier now appeared smaller, Older, diminished by the weight of consequences. She was only beginning to understand. Her uniform, previously immaculate, showed clear signs of stress, trembling hands, perspiration along her hairline. Despite the cabin's cool temperature, the slight dishevelment that comes with the realization that your world is collapsing. Ms. Hawkins. Captain Mueller said, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for the most serious flight operations discussions. I'm going to relay a message from Mr. David Rivera, CEO and majority owner of Skyline Airways. Patricia's eyes widened as the implications sank in. In 25 years with the airline, she had never heard of operational decisions being made directly by the CEO. Corporate executives stayed in their glass towers, issuing policy memos and quarterly directives through layers of middle management. They didn't involve themselves in routine passenger service issues, no matter how contentious. Which meant this wasn't routine. Which meant she was in more trouble than she had ever imagined possible. Patricia is about to find out she just assaulted the CEO's son. If you think her 25 years of getting away with discrimination are about to catch up with her, comment karma below. Subscribe, because what happens next is the definition of instant justice. The passenger you removed from seat 1B. Captain Mueller continued, reading directly from Rivera's message with the precision of someone who understood every word would be scrutinized by federal investigators. Is Marcus Rivera. He is Mr. Rivera's 16-year-old son. Multiple passengers recorded your interaction with him, including the moment you struck him. Those recordings are currently being reviewed by our legal department and will shortly be in the hands of federal investigators. Your employment with Skyline Airways is terminated, effective immediately. The words hit Patricia like physical blows, each syllable stripping away another layer of the professional identity she had built over a quarter-century. Her knees buckled slightly, and she gripped the back of Captain Mueller's chair for support as the cockpit seemed to shrink around her. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of aircraft systems. The boy was disruptive. He was threatening other passengers. "I was following established security protocols." Captain Mueller's expression hardened with the kind of professional disgust that comes from watching someone attempt to justify the unjustifiable. In 30 years of flying, he had developed a finely tuned ability to distinguish between legitimate safety concerns and creative fiction designed to cover up poor decisions. Patricia's description bore no resemblance to what he had observed through the cockpit's security monitors. Ms. Hawkins. I watched the entire incident on our internal cameras. At no point did Marcus Rivera raise his voice, make threatening gestures, or exhibit any behavior that could reasonably be construed as disruptive. He sat quietly in his assigned seat, reading a book, until you physically removed him, based on nothing more than your assumptions about who belongs in first class. The captain paused, consulting his notes from the conversation with Rivera. I'm also instructed to inform you that lying about the incident is considered obstruction of a federal investigation. Mr. Rivera suggests you carefully consider your next statements, because everything you say is being recorded for review by prosecutors. Patricia's mind raced through possible explanations, justifications, anything that might minimize the catastrophe engulfing her career. 25 years of service, stellar performance reviews, commendations for customer service excellence. Surely that history counted for something. Surely one mistake, one moment of poor judgment, couldn't erase a quarter-century of professional dedication. But even as she searched for excuses, Patricia understood that this wasn't really about poor judgment. This was about getting caught doing something she had done dozens of times before, something that had been quietly rewarded by supervisors who appreciated her ability to maintain appropriate standards in premium cabins. Captain, can I speak with Mr. Rivera directly? I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about what happened. The boy Marcus. He wasn't wearing appropriate attire for first class. Our policies are very clear about maintaining proper cabin standards. Captain Mueller activated the secure communication link allowing Patricia to see Rivera's face on the cockpit's main screen. The CEO's expression was cold professional and utterly unforgiving. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that Patricia had tried to project in the cabin, but could never truly master. Ms. Hawkins, I understand you want to explain your actions. Please proceed. Patricia straightened, drawing on years of customer service training to project confidence and professionalism, even as her world crumbled around her. Mr. Rivera, I want to sincerely apologize for any confusion about this incident. Your son was not properly dressed for our first-class cabin, and I was genuinely concerned about maintaining the appropriate atmosphere for our premium passengers. When he became argumentative about relocating to economy class, I may have accidentally made physical contact while trying to de-escalate the situation. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 15 seconds, filled with the kind of tension that precedes verdicts in criminal trials. When Rivera finally responded, his voice was so quiet that Patricia had to lean forward to hear him clearly. Ms. Hawkins, you just lied to me 3 separate times in 30 seconds. First, my son was appropriately dressed in business casual attire that meets or exceeds your published guidelines. Second, witness statements from multiple passengers confirm that he never argued with you, never raised his voice, and never exhibited anything approaching aggressive behavior. Third, you didn't accidentally make physical contact. You deliberately struck him in the face when he refused to surrender his phone. Rivera leaned closer to his camera, his face filling the screen with an expression of controlled fury that made Patricia's blood run cold. But your most significant error is assuming that I would accept your version of events when I have access to multiple video recordings, witness statements, and aircraft security footage showing exactly what happened. Rivera just exposed Patricia's lies with surgical precision. 3 lies in 30 seconds, all disproven by video evidence. If you think liars deserve to be exposed, comment lies exposed below and subscribe, because the truth always wins. Patricia felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of Rivera's words sank in. She had forgotten about the internal security cameras that monitored cabin activity during boarding procedures. Every word, every gesture, every moment of the confrontation had been recorded in high definition and was undoubtedly already in the hands of corporate investigators and federal prosecutors. So I was trying to maintain order in the cabin. Sometimes difficult passenger situations require firm responses to prevent disruption of other travelers. Rivera's laugh was cold enough to freeze aviation fuel. Ms. Hawkins, you determined that a well-behaved black teenager constituted a difficult passenger situation, requiring a firm response solely because he didn't match your preconceived notions of what first-class passengers should look like. That's not customer service, that's racial profiling followed by assault. He paused, consulting something off-screen that Patricia could only assume was legal documentation. Captain Mueller, please inform Ms. Hawkins that airport security will be boarding the aircraft in approximately 10 minutes to escort her from the plane. She should gather her personal belongings and prepare for questioning by federal investigators who specialize in hate crimes and civil rights violations. Patricia's professional facade finally cracked completely. 25 years of carefully maintained composure, collapsing under the weight of consequences she had never imagined possible. Mr. Rivera, please. I have a quarter-century with this company. I've never had a single disciplinary action. I was just following established procedures. Rivera's response was delivered with the precision of a surgeon making a final incision. Show me the established procedure that authorizes striking passengers, Ms. Hawkins. Show me the training manual that instructs crew members to remove people from paid seats because of their skin color. Show me the company policy that allows you to humiliate a minor in front of 37 witnesses. When Patricia couldn't respond, Rivera continued with surgical precision. You were following procedures, Ms. Hawkins. just not company procedures. You were following the informal, unwritten procedures that have allowed discrimination to flourish in this industry for decades. The procedures that teach crew members to trust their instincts about who belongs where. The procedures that prioritize the comfort of privileged passengers over the dignity of everyone else. Rivera just explained exactly how institutional racism works through unwritten rules that everyone knows but no one admits. If you think he's right, that discrimination hides behind instincts and procedures, comment unwritten rules and subscribe because he's exposing the whole system. Captain Mueller watched the exchange with growing discomfort and dawning recognition. He had worked with Patricia Hawkins on dozens of flights over the years and had always considered her a professional, competent crew member. But listening to her attempts to justify what was clearly unjustifiable conduct made him question how many similar incidents he had missed, ignored, or unconsciously enabled over the years. Ms. Hawkins Rivera said, his voice returning to a conversational tone that somehow felt more ominous than his earlier anger. I want you to understand something that extends far beyond your individual situation. This isn't just about you anymore. Your actions have exposed systematic problems in our training, our culture, and our commitment to serving all passengers with equal dignity. The investigation that's about to begin will examine every aspect of how Skyline Airways prepares its crew members for situations like this. He gestured towards something off-screen that suggested the full scope of the institutional response being mobilized. I have teams reviewing discrimination complaints going back 5 years. I have investigators interviewing every crew member who worked with you during that period. I have attorneys analyzing our liability for creating a workplace culture that enabled this incident. You didn't just assault my son, Ms. Hawkins. You revealed institutional failures that are going to cost this company millions of dollars and dozens of careers. Patricia's legs gave out entirely, and she sank into the cockpit's jump seat as the magnitude of what she had triggered became clear. This wasn't just about her termination or even criminal prosecution. It was about a company-wide reckoning that would examine every policy, every training program, every cultural assumption that had allowed her to believe her actions were justified and professional. The woman who had confidently wielded authority over passengers for 25 years was discovering that authority without accountability was just institutionalized bullying, and the bill had finally come due. "Sir," she said, her voice now barely a whisper, "what can I do to fix this?" Rivera's expression didn't change, but his words carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You can cooperate fully with federal investigators. You can admit that your actions were motivated by racial bias rather than legitimate safety concerns. And you can accept that your career in aviation is over. A knock on the cockpit door interrupted the conversation with the sound of consequences arriving in real time. Captain Mueller opened it to find 2 uniformed airport security officers and a woman in a business suit who identified herself as an FBI agent specializing in civil rights violations and hate crimes. Captain Mueller: "We're here to escort Patricia Hawkins from the aircraft and begin preliminary interviews regarding the alleged assault on a passenger." Patricia looked at the officers, then at Captain Mueller, then at Rivera's image on the communication screen. In the span of 90 minutes, she had gone from a respected senior flight attendant with an unblemished record to a federal criminal suspect whose actions had triggered an industry-wide crisis of accountability. Ms. Hawkins Rivera said, as the security officers moved to flank her, "I have one final message for you. My son handled this situation with more dignity and professionalism than you demonstrated in 25 years of service. He's going to recover from this incident and go on to accomplish great things. You're going to spend the next several years explaining to investigators, attorneys, and judges why you thought assault was an appropriate response to a teenager asking to sit in his assigned seat." As Patricia was escorted from the cockpit in handcuffs, Captain Mueller remained at his station, staring at the communication screen where Rivera's face still appeared. The CEO's expression had softened slightly, not with forgiveness, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who had just systematically dismantled the career of someone who had hurt his child. Captain Rivera said, "I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. Tell them that the delay was caused by a crew conduct violation that required immediate federal intervention. Tell them that Skyline Airways does not tolerate discrimination in any form. And tell them that we apologize for any inconvenience caused by our failure to maintain appropriate professional standards." Captain Mueller nodded, though he understood that the announcement would likely trigger immediate media attention and social media coverage that would make this incident a national story within hours. Admitting to crew misconduct during an active incident was unprecedented in commercial aviation, but so was a CEO's direct involvement in operational decisions affecting passenger rights. "Sir, what should I tell them about the specific nature of the conduct violation?" Rivera's smile carried the cold promise of institutional change that would ripple through the aviation industry for years to come. "Tell them the truth, Captain. Tell them that a crew member removed a passenger from his assigned seat and physically assaulted him because she didn't believe he belonged in first class. Tell them that behavior like that has no place in modern aviation and that Skyline Airways is taking immediate action to ensure it never happens again on any flight operated by any airline." As the communication link closed, Captain Mueller prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult and consequential passenger announcement of his career. In the cabin below, Marcus Rivera sat in economy class seat 32F, unaware that his father's response to 7 words in a text message had just reshaped the airline industry's approach to customer service, civil rights, and institutional accountability. The net was closing around everyone who had enabled, ignored, or participated in the discrimination that had flourished in aviation for decades. And David Rivera was just getting started with the systematic changes that would ensure his son's humiliation became the catalyst for industry-wide transformation. The passenger announcement crackled through Flight 847's cabin speakers at exactly 4:47 p.m. Pacific Time, delivered in Captain Mueller's gravelly voice, with the kind of professional calm usually reserved for routine weather delays or minor mechanical issues. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mueller speaking from the flight deck. We are currently experiencing a delay due to a serious crew conduct violation that requires immediate federal intervention. A member of our cabin crew removed a passenger from his assigned first-class seat and physically struck him because she determined he did not belong in that section. This behavior is completely unacceptable and violates both company policy and federal law. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Throughout the aircraft, passengers stopped their conversations mid-sentence, looked up from their phones and magazines, and stared at the speakers with expressions ranging from shock to validation to carefully concealed guilt. Stop everything and think about this moment. A pilot just announced that his crew assaulted a passenger for being black in first class. This has never happened before in aviation history. If you think this announcement changed everything, you're right. Comment "unprecedented" below and subscribe, because what happens next will shock you. In Seat 1B, the window seat that Marcus Rivera should have occupied from the beginning, Fortune 500 executive William Harrison slowly lowered his Wall Street Journal and looked around the cabin with new understanding. He had witnessed the entire confrontation between Patricia Hawkins and the young black passenger, had even felt a moment of unease when the flight attendant's questioning became overtly aggressive and discriminatory. But he had remained silent, assuming that crew members knew best about passenger placement and security protocols. Now, hearing the captain's announcement, Harrison realized he had watched a federal crime occur while choosing the comfort of non-involvement over the moral imperative to intervene when a child was being humiliated by an adult authority figure. The shame hit him like a physical weight settling in his stomach, with the nauseating recognition of complicity that would haunt him for years to come. Captain Mueller continued his unprecedented announcement with words that would be studied in business schools and congressional hearings for decades. The crew member in question has been removed from the aircraft by federal authorities and is currently under investigation for assault and civil rights violations. The passenger who was attacked has been returned to his original seat in first class, and Skyline Airways will provide full compensation to all passengers for this delay. We deeply apologize for this incident and want to assure you that discrimination in any form has no place in our operations or in modern aviation. In the economy section, Marcus Rivera sat in seat 32F. Listening to his father's influence reshaped the narrative of his humiliation in real time. He had expected consequences for Patricia Hawkins' termination, certainly possibly legal action. But the public acknowledgement of discrimination, the admission of institutional failure, the commitment to transparency, these were responses that went far beyond personal vindication. This was systematic change happening in real time. Robert Chen, the technology journalist in seat 2A, was already composing social media posts that would reach his 3 million followers within minutes. But unlike his usual rapid-fire commentary on industry trends and startup valuations, Chen found himself struggling to find words adequate for what he had just witnessed and failed to prevent. He had recorded Patricia Hawkins's assault on Marcus Rivera, had captured the teenager's dignified response and the cabin's shameful silence in high-definition detail. But he had also been part of that silence, choosing documentation over intervention when a minor was being humiliated and physically assaulted by an adult authority figure. Chen's thumb hovered over his phone screen as he considered how to frame the incident for maximum impact while acknowledging his own moral failure. The easy narrative would focus on Patricia Hawkins as a rogue employee whose actions didn't represent broader industry problems. The comfortable story would treat this as an isolated incident requiring individual accountability rather than systematic reform. But Chen was a journalist, committed to uncomfortable truths, and the uncomfortable truth was that every passenger in first class had watched discrimination unfold without saying a word. The uncomfortable truth was that Marcus Rivera's dignified response had exposed the moral cowardice of 37 adults who had prioritized their own comfort over a teenager's civil rights. Here's the hardest truth of all. Everyone in first class watched a child get assaulted and did nothing. If you think bystander silence enables racism, comment, silence enables racism, and subscribe, because Chen is about to hold all of them accountable, including himself. As Chen began typing his social media thread, Jennifer Torres made her way through the cabin, ostensibly checking passenger comfort, but actually observing the aftermath of Captain Mueller's historic announcement. As the junior flight attendant who had witnessed Patricia's assault on Marcus, Jennifer understood that her testimony would be crucial to any federal investigation. But more than that, she understood that her silence during the incident made her complicit in ways that would define the rest of her career in aviation. She had seen Patricia's escalating aggression, had recognized the racial undertones in her questioning, had watched the situation spiral toward violence without finding the courage to intervene or report the behavior to supervisors. In her 3 years with Skyline Airways, Jennifer had been trained extensively on customer service protocols, emergency procedures, and safety regulations. But no training manual had prepared her for the moment when a senior colleague's behavior crossed from unprofessional to criminal. No policy guide had explained how to challenge a 25-year veteran who was clearly violating company standards and federal law in front of dozens of witnesses. As she moved through the cabin, Jennifer noticed the profound change in atmosphere among the passengers. The comfortable insulation of first class, the sense of elevation and exclusivity that premium seating was supposed to provide had been shattered by the recognition that their sanctuary had been built on foundations of discrimination and maintained through collective complicity. In Seat 3C, Federal Judge Margaret Washington closed her laptop and stared out the window at the Los Angeles skyline, her legal mind processing the civil rights implications of what she had witnessed and failed to address. As one of the few black passengers in first class, she had watched Patricia's interrogation of Marcus with growing alarm and personal recognition. She had seen the coded language, the escalating suspicion, the fundamental assumption that a young black man couldn't possibly belong in premium seating. Judge Washington had said nothing during the incident, partly from shock, but also from the learned caution that came with being one of the few black women on the federal bench. She had spent her career choosing her battles carefully, understanding that being seen as confrontational or difficult could undermine her authority in ways that her white colleagues never had to consider. But listening to Captain Mueller's announcement, Judge Washington realized that her silence had contributed to the very discrimination she had fought against throughout her legal career. Her presence in first class meant nothing if she wasn't willing to use her voice and position to defend others who belonged there, but were being denied that right based on their appearance. She pulled out her phone and began composing an email to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, providing her contact information as a witness to what federal investigators would undoubtedly classify as a hate crime, with multiple witnesses who had failed to intervene. Judge Washington just realized that being successful doesn't protect you from racism, and staying silent when others face discrimination makes you part of the problem. If you think even successful people have a responsibility to speak up, comment, speak up, and subscribe, because her testimony will be crucial. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Mueller was coordinating with Los Angeles International Airport authorities to manage the federal investigation that was already beginning to unfold. FBI agents were boarding the aircraft to conduct preliminary interviews with passengers and crew members. Airport security was establishing secure areas for evidence collection and witness statements. Most significantly, David Rivera's corporate jet had just received clearance for immediate departure from Atlanta, carrying the CEO and a team of attorneys toward what would become the most highly publicized passenger rights incident in aviation history. As federal agents made their way through the cabin, passengers who had remained silent during Marcus's humiliation suddenly found their voices and their consciences. William Harrison volunteered detailed statements about Patricia's discriminatory questioning and escalating aggression. Judge Washington provided her contact information and offered to testify in any criminal proceedings that might result from the investigation. Even passengers from economy class, who had only heard second-hand accounts of the incident, came forward with observations about the changed atmosphere in first class following Marcus's removal and the visible distress of some passengers who had witnessed the assault. Robert Chen handed over his phone to FBI investigators, providing the complete video recording of Patricia's assault on Marcus Rivera. As he watched federal agents download the footage that would soon be examined by prosecutors and congressional investigators, Chen realized that his documentation carried both evidential value and moral weight that would follow him for the rest of his career. The video would provide objective proof of what had occurred and establish a clear timeline of events. But it would also raise uncomfortable questions about why he had chosen to record rather than intervene, why he had prioritized documentation over the defense of a minor being assaulted by an adult authority figure. In Seat 32F, Marcus Rivera watched federal agents work their way through the cabin, interviewing passengers and collecting evidence with the systematic thoroughness of a major criminal investigation. He understood that his father's response had transformed a personal humiliation into a national conversation about discrimination in aviation and the complicity of silence in enabling institutional racism. The text message he had sent, 7 words describing his treatment by Patricia Hawkins, had triggered an investigation that would examine every aspect of airline customer service crew training and corporate culture. But more than that, it had exposed the complicity of silence that allowed discrimination to flourish in full view of witnesses who chose comfort over courage. Marcus pulled out his phone and composed a message to his father. FBI is interviewing passengers. They all want to help now that there are consequences. Marcus just exposed the ugly truth about bystander behavior. Everyone wants to help. After the cameras show up and the FBI arrives, where were they when he needed help? Comment your thoughts below and subscribe, because his observation cuts deep. David Rivera, 35,000 feet above Texas on his corporate jet, read his son's message and smiled grimly. He understood the psychology of moral cowardice and how quickly it could transform into righteous cooperation once consequences became apparent and failure to cooperate carried its own risks. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness. The passengers and crew members who were now volunteering statements and offering testimony had remained silent when their voices could have prevented his son's humiliation and assault. Their willingness to help after the fact was legally valuable, but morally inadequate. As his jet continued toward Los Angeles, Rivera reviewed preliminary investigation reports compiled by his legal team. Patricia Hawkins had been detained by federal authorities and was being held pending formal charges of assault and civil rights violations. The FBI was treating the incident as a potential hate crime, which carried federal penalties far more severe than simple assault charges. More importantly, the Department of Transportation was launching a comprehensive review of Skyline Airways training practices, hiring procedures, and corporate culture. The investigation would examine whether Patricia's actions reflected broader institutional problems that required systematic reform rather than individual discipline. Rivera welcomed the federal scrutiny with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting years for an opportunity to address problems he had long suspected. He wanted investigators to examine every aspect of his company's operations to identify and eliminate any policies or practices that enabled or encouraged discrimination. If Skyline Airways was going to be the catalyst for industry-wide reform, he intended to ensure that the changes were thorough, permanent, and impossible to reverse. As Flight 847 remained grounded at LAX, surrounded by federal agents and news crews who had already begun gathering at the airport, Rivera reviewed social media monitoring reports that showed the story beginning to gain national attention. Robert Chen's initial posts had been shared over 50,000 times in the first hour. The hashtag Skyline Discrimination was trending on multiple platforms. Major news outlets were requesting interviews with witnesses and company officials. Most significantly, other passengers from other flights were beginning to share their own experiences with discriminatory treatment by airline personnel across multiple carriers. Stories of humiliation profiling and casual racism that had previously been dismissed as isolated incidents were now being understood as part of a systematic pattern that the aviation industry had ignored, enabled, or actively covered up for decades. Rivera's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Goldberg, Congressional Commerce Committee, requesting immediate hearing. DOJ opening formal civil rights investigation. Stock down 12% in after-hours trading, but customer support calls running 90% positive. He typed back, "Schedule the hearing for next week. Cooperate fully with DOJ. Give them everything they ask for, plus everything they don't know to ask for. And buy more stock while it's cheap. We're about to become the gold standard for passenger rights and corporate accountability." As the corporate jet began its descent into Los Angeles, Rivera looked out at the city where his son sat in an economy seat. He should never have been forced to occupy, surrounded by federal agents, investigating an assault that should never have occurred in a civilized society. But sometimes, Rivera reflected, injustice created opportunities for justice. Patricia Hawkins's assault on Marcus had exposed institutional problems that could now be addressed comprehensively. The passengers' silence had been documented and would serve as a permanent reminder of the cost of moral cowardice. The industry's discriminatory practices had been thrust into public view, where they could no longer be ignored, excused, or quietly managed. His son had sent 7 words that would reshape how airlines treated passengers and how American society thought about the responsibility of bystanders to protect civil rights. Now it was time to ensure that the changes were meaningful, permanent, and industry-wide. The reckoning was just beginning, and David Rivera intended to see it through to completion. At 7:23 p.m. Pacific Time, Robert Chen pressed tweet on a message that would redefine public discourse around airline discrimination for the next decade. The technology journalist, still sitting in seat 2A of the grounded Flight 847, had spent over an hour crafting a social media thread that balanced his professional obligations as a reporter with his personal shame at remaining silent during Marcus Rivera's humiliation and assault. The first tweet was simple, devastating, and brutally honest. "I just watched a Skyline Air flight attendant slap a 16-year-old black passenger and force him out of first class because she didn't think he belonged there. I recorded it. I also stayed silent like a coward when I should have intervened." Thread plus video below. Skyline discrimination. Robert Chen just did something almost no one does. He took responsibility for his own failure while exposing injustice. If you think admitting your mistakes while fighting for justice takes courage, comment "Real accountability" below. Subscribe, because what happens next will restore your faith in the power of truth. The attached video showed 90 seconds of crystal-clear footage, Patricia Hawkins questioning Marcus Rivera's ticket validity with barely concealed hostility, her escalating aggression as he calmly maintained his right to his assigned seat, and the sharp crack of her palm against his cheek that made viewers across the country wince in sympathetic pain and righteous anger. But what made the video particularly powerful was Marcus's response. No anger, no retaliation, no dramatic outburst. Just dignified acceptance of an injustice he had clearly experienced before, combined with the quiet strength of someone who understood that his reaction would be scrutinized and judged by people looking for any excuse to blame the victim. Within 15 minutes, the video had been viewed 100,000 times. Within an hour, that number reached 1 million. By midnight Eastern Time, Chen's thread had been shared by celebrities, politicians, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who recognized something profound in Marcus Rivera's quiet dignity and Chen's uncommon willingness to acknowledge his own moral failure. But the viral spread of the video was only part of the story, unfolding in real time across social media platforms. What made Skyline discrimination a cultural phenomenon was how it gave voice to thousands of travelers who had experienced similar treatment but lacked the platform resources or documentation to seek accountability for discriminatory behavior by airline personnel. The hashtag became a repository for stories of discrimination, profiling, and casual racism that had previously been dismissed as isolated incidents, misunderstandings, or the inevitable friction of modern air travel. Each shared story added crucial context to Marcus's experience, demonstrating that Patricia Hawkins's behavior was part of a systematic pattern rather than an individual failing. A black businesswoman from Chicago shared her experience of being asked to verify her first-class ticket 3 separate times on a single flight, while white passengers boarded without question. A Latino family from Phoenix described being separated and questioned about their immigration status during what should have been routine security screening. An elderly Muslim man from Detroit recounted being removed from his seat because other passengers claimed they were uncomfortable with his presence. Every story shared under Skyline discrimination proves this wasn't about one bad employee. This was about an entire system designed to make people of color feel unwelcome. If you've experienced discrimination while traveling, your voice matters. Share your story and subscribe, because change happens when truth becomes impossible to ignore. Each story added layers of evidence to what civil rights attorneys would later describe as the most comprehensive documentation of systematic discrimination in commercial aviation history. The aviation industry's discrimination problem was being documented in real time by the people who had experienced it firsthand, creating an evidentiary record that would prove crucial in federal investigations and congressional hearings. At Skyline Airways headquarters in Atlanta, the company's crisis management team watched the viral explosion with a mixture of professional fascination and personal horror. Maria Santos Rivera's executive assistant had been monitoring social media metrics since the incident occurred. She now stood before a wall of screens showing trending hashtags, share rates, and sentiment analysis that painted a devastating but ultimately accurate picture of public opinion. We're at 4 million views across all platforms and climbing exponentially, she announced to the emergency response team that had assembled in the main conference room. Traditional media outlets are picking up the story: CNN, NBC, Washington Post, New York Times. Congressional representatives are demanding immediate hearings. The ACLU is offering legal representation to the Rivera family, and the Department of Justice has opened a preliminary civil rights investigation. Sarah Goldberg, the chief operations officer, looked up from her laptop, where she was monitoring the company's stock price in after-hours trading. We're down 18% and falling, but the more concerning issue is the pattern analysis our legal team is seeing. The video has triggered over 3,000 individual complaints from passengers claiming similar treatment by our personnel. If even 10% of those result in legitimate lawsuits. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood that Skyline Airways was facing potential legal liability that could reach hundreds of millions of dollars. More importantly, they were confronting a fundamental challenge to their corporate culture that would require complete transformation of their training, hiring, and operational practices. But David Rivera had anticipated this response when he chose transparency over damage control. As his corporate jet taxied to a private terminal at LAX, he reviewed the social media explosion with satisfaction rather than concern. Every viral share of Marcus's humiliation created political pressure for industry-wide reform. Every personal story of discrimination documented the scope of the problem and the urgent need for comprehensive solutions. Sir, said James Morrison, Skyline Airways chief legal counsel, as the jet came to a stop, the viral response is beyond anything our crisis management protocols anticipated. We're receiving interview requests from every major news outlet in the country. Congressional offices are demanding testimony from senior leadership, and civil rights organizations are calling for industry-wide boycotts. Rivera unbuckled his seatbelt and straightened his tie with the calm precision of someone who had just won the first battle in a war he intended to finish. Outstanding, James. The more attention this receives, the harder it becomes for other airlines to ignore their own discrimination problems. We're not just fixing Skyline Airways, we're fixing an entire industry that has been broken for decades. As Rivera's motorcade departed LAX for the airport, where his son remained under FBI protection, the viral explosion was creating ripple effects throughout the aviation sector and beyond. Other airlines were conducting emergency reviews of recent customer complaints, desperately searching for patterns that might indicate systematic discrimination before federal investigators found them first. Flight attendant unions were issuing carefully worded statements distancing themselves from Patricia Hawkins while defending the professionalism of their membership. Congressional staffers were drafting legislation to strengthen passenger rights protections and increase penalties for discriminatory treatment. Civil rights organizations were mobilizing resources for what they recognized as a watershed moment in transportation equity. The domino effect is incredible. One slap, one video, one father's refusal to stay quiet. And now the entire aviation industry is being forced to confront decades of discrimination. If you think this proves how individual courage can create systematic change, comment. Courage creates change, and subscribe, because we're witnessing history. Most significantly, other passengers from Flight 847 were becoming reluctant celebrities, as news outlets sought first-hand accounts of the incident and the moral failures that had enabled it. William Harrison, the Fortune 500 executive who had remained silent during Marcus's humiliation, found himself fielding interview requests from reporters who wanted to understand why 37 witnesses had failed to intervene when a child was being assaulted. "I've been asking myself that question for hours," Harrison told a CNN producer who had tracked down his contact information through business directories. "The honest answer is that I assumed the flight attendant knew what she was doing. I assumed there must be some legitimate reason, some security concern or policy violation that I didn't understand. It never occurred to me that I was watching racial discrimination in real time, and that assumption is exactly how systematic racism survives in professional environments." His admission broadcast during CNN's evening coverage became a powerful illustration of how institutional racism operates through the complicity of well-meaning bystanders. Harrison's failure to intervene wasn't motivated by racial animus, but by the comfortable assumption that institutional authority must have legitimate justification for its actions, even when those actions violated basic human dignity. It was the kind of passive enablement that allowed discrimination to flourish behind facades of professionalism and procedure, creating plausible deniability for both individual prejudice and institutional bias. Judge Margaret Washington provided a different but equally important perspective during her interview with NBC News. As a federal judge and one of the few black passengers in first class, she understood both the legal implications of what she had witnessed and the complex personal dynamics that had prevented her from intervening. "I recognized what was happening to Marcus Rivera because I've experienced similar treatment throughout my career," she explained to the network's legal correspondent. "But I also hesitated to intervene because I know how quickly a black woman who speaks up gets labeled as difficult or confrontational. That calculation, choosing personal safety over moral obligation, is something that people of color have to make every day in professional settings." Her analysis resonated particularly strongly with viewers who understood the complex dynamics of discrimination and resistance in American society. Judge Washington's honesty about her own failure to act provided crucial context for understanding how systematic racism operates even among those who are personally committed to civil rights and have achieved positions of authority and influence. Judge Washington just revealed the impossible choice many people of color face: speak up and risk being labeled difficult, or stay silent and watch others suffer. This is how systematic racism traps even successful people. If you think this system needs to change, comment impossible choices and subscribe, because her honesty is opening eyes nationwide. As the viral phenomenon continued to grow exponentially, Marcus Rivera became the reluctant center of a national conversation about dignity, discrimination, and the cost of silence in American society. Sitting in a private terminal at LAX while FBI agents completed their preliminary investigation, he scrolled through social media responses to Chen's video with a mixture of validation, overwhelm, and mature understanding of the responsibility that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. Thousands of people were sharing their own stories of discrimination, expressing outrage at his treatment, and calling for systematic reform throughout the aviation industry and beyond. But Marcus also saw responses that minimized the incident, questioned his family's motives for seeking publicity, and suggested that Patricia Hawkins had been justified in her suspicions about a black teenager in first class. The polarized reactions reminded Marcus that changing institutional behavior was far more complex than viral videos and social media outrage could accomplish alone. Real transformation required sustained effort, legal accountability, and cultural shifts that couldn't be achieved through hashtags and celebrity endorsements, no matter how well-intentioned or widely shared. His phone buzzed with a message from his father, landing in 10 minutes. "Are you ready to change how airlines treat passengers forever?" Marcus looked around the private terminal, where FBI agents were wrapping up their evidence collection, where news crews were gathering for what would undoubtedly be his first public statement, where congressional staffers were already requesting meetings to discuss legislative responses to airline discrimination and the broader implications for civil rights enforcement. He typed back with the quiet confidence of someone who had already proven his strength under pressure. "I've been ready my whole life, Dad. Let's finish what we started." The viral explosion of skyline discrimination had created a moment of national attention that could either fade into another trending topic or crystallize into lasting institutional change that would protect millions of passengers for generations to come. Marcus understood that his response to that attention would determine which outcome prevailed, and whether his humiliation would become a catalyst for justice or just another viral video that people shared and forgot. As David Rivera's motorcade approached LAX, social media monitoring teams at airlines across the country were conducting emergency analyses of their own customer service records, desperately searching for incidents that might trigger similar viral explosions and federal investigations. The aviation industry was beginning to understand that the comfortable era of dismissing discrimination complaints as isolated incidents or customer misunderstandings was ending forever. Patricia Hawkins's assault on Marcus Rivera had been recorded, documented, and shared with millions of viewers who could no longer pretend that airline discrimination was a relic of the past or an exaggerated complaint from oversensitive passengers. The question now was whether that moment of recognition would translate into the kind of systematic reform that could prevent future incidents and create genuine accountability for discriminatory behavior. Chen, still sitting in seat 2A, as federal agents prepared to release Flight 847's passengers, composed his final tweet of the evening. The video shows 90 seconds of discrimination and assault, but it took 37 passengers staying silent to make it possible. We all need to be better than we were today. Skyline. Discrimination bystanders. Enable racism. Chen's final tweet cuts to the heart of everything. It's not just about the person who did wrong. It's about all the people who let it happen. The real question isn't how could Patricia do this? It's how could 37 adults watch it happen and do nothing? If you commit to being better than a silent bystander, comment, "No more silence," and subscribe, because change starts with each of us. That tweet, with its uncomfortable focus on complicity rather than just condemnation, would become one of the most shared messages in the entire viral phenomenon. Because ultimately, the power of Marcus Rivera's story lay not just in documenting injustice, but in forcing viewers to examine their own role in enabling or challenging the discrimination they witnessed every day in airports, workplaces, schools, and communities across America. The recording was live, viewed by millions, and impossible to ignore. The conversation about systematic discrimination and bystander responsibility had begun in earnest, and the aviation industry, along with American society more broadly, would never be the same. The viral explosion had created the pressure for change. Now came the much harder work of ensuring that pressure translated into lasting reform that would protect human dignity for generations to come. The FBI field office in Los Angeles had processed thousands of civil rights cases over the decades, but the investigation into Flight 847 represented something unprecedented in aviation history: a discrimination incident with multiple high-definition recordings, dozens of credible witnesses, and a victim whose family possessed both the moral authority and financial resources to pursue accountability through every available legal channel. Special Agent Detective Amanda Wright, had been assigned to lead the investigation based on her expertise in hate crime prosecutions and civil rights violations. As she reviewed the preliminary evidence collected from the aircraft, Wright recognized that this case would likely become a watershed moment for passenger rights enforcement in commercial aviation and a defining test of federal civil rights laws in the modern era. The evidence was overwhelming in its clarity and devastating in its implications. Chen's video showed Patricia Hawkins' assault on Marcus Rivera with courtroom-quality clarity that left no room for alternative interpretations. The aircraft's internal security cameras had captured the entire incident from multiple angles, providing additional documentation that corroborated every detail of the discriminatory treatment and physical assault. Witness statements from passengers and crew members confirmed every aspect of the confrontation, creating a comprehensive record that would be nearly impossible to challenge in federal court. But what made the case particularly significant from an institutional perspective was the documented pattern of systematic failure it revealed. The FBI just discovered something that will shock you. Patricia wasn't acting alone. She was operating within a system that had been rewarding this exact behavior for decades. If you think this proves institutional racism is real, comment. Systemic racism is real below, and subscribe, because what they found will expose an entire industry. We're not just prosecuting one flight attendant for one incident, Wright explained to her investigative team during their initial briefing at the federal building in downtown Los Angeles. We're examining whether Skyline Airways created a corporate culture that made incidents like this inevitable rather than aberrant. That means reviewing training materials, examining personnel files, analyzing complaint records, and interviewing employees across the entire organization to understand how discrimination became normalized. The investigation's scope expanded rapidly as federal agents uncovered layer after layer of evidence pointing to systematic problems within the airline industry. Skyline Airways customer service records revealed hundreds of complaints involving discriminatory treatment over the past 5 years, most of which had been dismissed as misunderstandings, personality conflicts, or the inevitable friction of modern air travel. Training materials contained language that encouraged crew members to trust their instincts about passenger behavior without providing clear guidelines for distinguishing between legitimate security concerns and racial profiling. Performance evaluation forms included subjective categories like maintains appropriate cabin standards and ensures passenger comfort without defining what those standards entailed or how they should be applied consistently across different demographic groups. Most damaging to the airline's legal position were the internal communications discovered during the federal investigation. Email threads between crew members contained casual references to passenger demographics and unspoken assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. Supervisor reports praised employees for their ability to handle difficult passengers and maintain order in ways that clearly correlated with discriminatory treatment of travelers from marginalized communities. Lisa Park, the civil rights attorney representing the Rivera family, had built her career challenging discriminatory practices in corporate America. But the evidence emerging from the Skyline Airways investigation represented one of the clearest and most comprehensive cases of institutional racism she had ever encountered in 3 decades of civil rights litigation. What we're seeing isn't just individual bias or isolated incidents, Park explained during a press conference outside the federal courthouse in Los Angeles. We're seeing systematic failure at every level of corporate oversight and accountability. Training programs that actively encouraged profiling, supervision that ignored obvious warning signs, complaint procedures that were designed to dismiss legitimate concerns rather than address them. This incident was the inevitable result of organizational choices that prioritized the comfort of some passengers over the civil rights of others. Attorney Lisa Park just exposed the truth. This wasn't one bad employee. This was a system designed to discriminate. The training encouraged it. Supervisors ignored it, and complaint procedures covered it up. If you think this deserves federal prosecution, comment. Prosecute the system and subscribe because justice is coming. As news of the expanding federal investigation spread throughout the aviation industry, other airlines began conducting internal reviews of their own practices, with the desperate urgency of companies trying to avoid similar federal scrutiny. The Department of Transportation launched a comprehensive examination of passenger rights enforcement across all major carriers, focusing particularly on complaint resolution procedures and crew training protocols that might enable or encourage discriminatory treatment. Congressional reaction was swift, bipartisan, and unusually unified around the need for immediate reform. The House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure announced comprehensive hearings on airline discrimination with Chairman Robert DeFazio, calling for systematic reform of industry practices that have allowed civil rights violations to flourish behind a facade of customer service professionalism. Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced emergency legislation that would strengthen federal oversight of airline operations, while Senator Ted Cruz called for industry self-regulation to address isolated incidents that don't represent the professionalism of most airline employees. The bipartisan nature of the response reflected the moral clarity of the case and the political impossibility of defending institutional discrimination captured in high-definition video. But it was the response from airline employees themselves that proved most significant for long-term institutional reform. Jennifer Torres, the junior flight attendant who had witnessed Patricia's assault on Marcus, agreed to cooperate fully with federal investigators and testify about the cultural pressures that had prevented her from intervening when she knew discrimination was occurring. "I knew what Patricia was doing was wrong from the moment she started questioning Marcus about his ticket," Torres explained during her FBI interview. But she was a 25-year veteran with outstanding performance reviews and strong support from management. "I was a 3-year employee who had been explicitly taught that maintaining crew unity was essential for operational safety and career advancement. Speaking up would have been seen as insubordination and betrayal, not moral courage." Torres's testimony revealed the institutional dynamics that enabled discrimination to flourish even when individual employees recognized problematic behavior and wanted to intervene. Junior staff members were systematically discouraged from challenging senior colleagues, even when those colleagues violated company policies or federal law. Complaint procedures were designed to protect companies from liability rather than address legitimate concerns about employee misconduct. Jennifer Torres just exposed how good employees are punished for doing the right thing, while bad employees are protected for doing the wrong thing. This is how institutional racism survives, by making heroes into villains. If you think whistleblowers should be protected, comment. Protect whistleblowers and subscribe because her courage is changing everything. Most importantly for the federal investigation, Torres's cooperation with law enforcement encouraged other airline employees across multiple carriers to come forward with their own accounts of discriminatory practices they had witnessed, experienced, or been pressured to ignore during their careers in commercial aviation. Flight attendants from United American and Delta Airlines provided detailed statements describing systematic passenger profiling, discriminatory enforcement of policies based on race and ethnicity, and corporate cultures that explicitly prioritized the preferences of premium passengers over the civil rights of all travelers. The investigation also revealed the economic incentives that actively encouraged discriminatory behavior throughout the industry. Airlines relied heavily on customer satisfaction scores and online reviews from first-class and business-class passengers, creating systematic pressure to maintain what marketing materials euphemistically called appropriate cabin atmosphere. Crew members understood through formal training and informal mentorship that complaints from premium passengers carried significantly more weight than complaints from economy travelers, creating powerful incentives to prioritize the comfort and preferences of wealthier, predominantly white passengers over the civil rights and human dignity of all travelers. The investigation's most legally damaging revelation came through statistical analysis of Skyline Airways' hiring and promotion practices over the past decade. Federal investigators discovered clear patterns in crew assignments, with employees of color disproportionately assigned to economy sections, while white employees were systematically favored for premium cabin positions that offered better pay tips and career advancement opportunities. Performance evaluations consistently rated white employees higher on subjective measures like professionalism, customer rapport, and cultural fit, while employees of color received lower scores, despite identical or superior performance on objective metrics like safety compliance, punctuality, and technical competency. Patricia Hawkins herself had been promoted to head flight attendant positions, based partly on evaluations that praised her ability to maintain appropriate standards and ensure passenger comfort in premium cabins. The language was coded but transparent to anyone familiar with the history of discrimination in customer service industries. She had been rewarded throughout her career for the very discriminatory behavior that led to her assault on Marcus Rivera. The evidence is overwhelming. Patricia was promoted for 25 years, specifically because she discriminated against black passengers. The system didn't just enable racism, it rewarded it. If this makes you angry, comment. Racism was rewarded, and subscribe, because the whole truth is even worse. Dr. Michael Thompson, a civil rights expert at Georgetown University, serving as a consultant on the federal investigation, analyzed the systematic nature of the problems uncovered at Skyline Airways and found patterns that extended throughout the commercial aviation industry. What we're documenting is institutional racism operating at every level of corporate decision-making, Thompson explained in his preliminary report to federal investigators. Hiring practices that systematically favor certain demographics, training programs that explicitly encourage subjective judgment calls about passenger behavior, performance evaluations that reward maintaining undefined standards that consistently correlate with discriminatory treatment, complaint procedures specifically designed to dismiss concerns as misunderstandings rather than address institutional problems. Thompson's analysis continued with devastating clarity. The Marcus Rivera incident wasn't an aberration or deviation from company policy. It was the predictable and inevitable result of organizational choices made consistently over decades to prioritize profit margins and passenger comfort over civil rights and human dignity. As the federal investigation expanded beyond Skyline Airways, other victims of airline discrimination began coming forward with their own experiences, creating a comprehensive record of systematic abuse that had been hidden, ignored, or actively covered up by industry practices. The case that proved most significant for establishing patterns of institutional discrimination was Dr. Aisha Johnson, a black pediatrician from Detroit, who had been removed from a first-class seat on a Skyline Airways flight just 3 months before Marcus Rivera's experience. Dr. Johnson had been traveling to a medical conference when flight attendant Patricia Hawkins questioned her ticket validity, suggested she might be more comfortable in economy class, and ultimately had her escorted from the aircraft by airport security when she insisted on remaining in her legally assigned seat. Unlike Marcus's case, Dr. Johnson's removal had generated no video evidence, no viral social media attention, and no federal investigation. Just a quiet settlement offer and confidentiality agreement that prevented her from discussing the incident publicly. I filed a formal complaint with the airline and was offered a travel voucher and upgrade certificates for future flights, Dr. Johnson explained during her FBI interview. They told me it was a misunderstanding about employee travel policies and seating assignments. I accepted their explanation and signed their agreement, because challenging it would have required legal resources I didn't have and media attention I didn't want. Dr. Johnson's case proves this wasn't Patricia's first time, and it shows how airlines use money and legal agreements to silence victims and cover up systematic discrimination. If you think these cover-ups need to end, comment, "No more cover-ups," and subscribe, because the truth is finally coming out. Dr. Johnson's experience demonstrated exactly how discrimination incidents were typically handled throughout the industry, quietly dismissed with minimal compensation, vague explanations that discouraged further inquiry, and legal agreements that prevented victims from sharing their experiences or warning others about problematic employees. Her case also revealed that Patricia Hawkins had engaged in virtually identical discriminatory behavior multiple times over her career, establishing a clear pattern of conduct that had been ignored, enabled, and in some cases explicitly rewarded by supervisors who valued her ability to maintain appropriate demographics in premium seating areas. The expanding federal investigation triggered a wave of class action lawsuits against not only Skyline Airways, but other major carriers, whose practices were now being scrutinized by investigators, civil rights attorneys, and congressional oversight committees. Legal firms across the country began reviewing airline complaint records, systematically looking for patterns of discriminatory treatment that could support broader challenges to industry practices. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Patricia Hawkins was proceeding through federal court with unusual speed and public attention. The assault charges were legally straightforward. Multiple witnesses and video evidence made her guilt indisputable under any reasonable interpretation of federal law. But federal prosecutors were also pursuing civil rights violations under hate crime statutes, arguing that her actions were motivated by racial animus and represented a systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior that violated Marcus Rivera's constitutional rights and the civil rights of countless other passengers who had experienced similar treatment. Patricia's defense attorney, court-appointed, after she exhausted her life savings on private counsel, faced the legally impossible task of explaining away video evidence that showed his client physically striking a minor passenger for asserting his right to sit in his assigned seat. The defense strategy focused on portraying Patricia as a dedicated employee who had made an error in judgment during a stressful situation. But this narrative collapsed completely when prosecutors introduced comprehensive evidence of her previous discriminatory conduct. Ms. Hawkins didn't make an error in judgment or lose control during a difficult situation. Federal prosecutor Janet Martinez argued during preliminary hearings. She engaged in a deliberate pattern of racial profiling that culminated in the assault of a minor passenger. This wasn't a momentary lapse in professional standards. It was the predictable escalation of discriminatory behavior that had been consistently rewarded rather than corrected by her employer. As Patricia's criminal trial approached, the broader federal investigation was producing legislative proposals that would fundamentally reshape passenger rights protections in commercial aviation and establish new standards for corporate accountability in civil rights enforcement. Senator Warren's comprehensive reform bill included mandatory bias training, standardized complaint procedures, federal oversight of crew performance evaluations, and substantial financial penalties for discriminatory treatment. The bill also included the Marcus Rivera Amendment, which would require airlines to publicly report all discrimination complaints and their resolution, creating transparency that would make it impossible for carriers to quietly dismiss legitimate concerns about employee misconduct or systematic bias. Industry lobbying groups initially opposed the proposed legislation, arguing that isolated incidents shouldn't trigger comprehensive federal oversight of airline operations. But as the investigation revealed the systematic nature of discrimination problems across multiple carriers, political opposition began crumbling under public pressure and the undeniable evidence of institutional failure. United Airlines announced voluntary adoption of enhanced bias training and transparent complaint procedures. American Airlines committed to diversifying crew assignments and completely revising performance evaluation criteria. Delta Airlines established an independent passenger rights ombudsman program with authority to investigate and resolve discrimination complaints without corporate interference. But it was David Rivera's response that proved most influential in reshaping industry practices and establishing new standards for corporate leadership in civil rights issues. Rather than simply cooperating with federal investigators, Rivera had instructed his legal team to conduct the most exhaustive internal review in corporate history, identifying and eliminating any policies or practices that could enable discrimination. The results were published in a comprehensive report that became the model for industry reform and corporate accountability. Skyline Airways revealed statistical disparities in crew assignments, performance evaluations, and complaint resolution that demonstrated systematic bias throughout their operations. They announced immediate changes to hiring practices, training programs, and corporate culture that went far beyond federal requirements and industry standards. Most significantly, Rivera established an independent civil rights compliance office with unprecedented authority to investigate discrimination complaints, discipline employees who violated passenger rights, and recommend policy changes to prevent future incidents. The office was staffed by civil rights attorneys and community advocates, rather than company employees, ensuring complete independence from corporate pressure to minimize problems or protect the airline's reputation. We're not just changing our policies or updating our training materials, Rivera explained during a press conference, announcing the comprehensive reforms. We're fundamentally changing our culture and our understanding of what customer service means in a diverse society. Every employee needs to understand that treating passengers with dignity and respect isn't optional or situational. It's the absolute foundation of our business model and our corporate values. As the federal investigation continued to expand, Marcus Rivera had become a reluctant but increasingly powerful advocate for passenger rights reform and institutional accountability. His dignity in the face of humiliation, combined with his family's resources and unwavering commitment to transparency, had created a unique opportunity to address systematic problems that had plagued the aviation industry for decades, while serving as a model for civil rights enforcement in other sectors of American society. But Marcus understood that lasting change required much more than viral videos, federal investigations, and congressional hearings. It required fundamental shifts in corporate culture, employee training, and legal accountability that could only be achieved through sustained pressure, comprehensive reform, and the recognition that protecting civil rights was everyone's responsibility, rather than just the burden of those who experienced discrimination directly. The investigation had exposed the scope and severity of the problem. The real work of solving it systematically and permanently was just beginning. 6 weeks after Patricia Hawkins' assault on Marcus Rivera, the repercussions were reverberating through every level of the aviation industry and spreading far beyond commercial air travel into other sectors of American society. Congressional Commerce Committee Chairman Robert DeFazio gavelled the first day of comprehensive hearings to order in a packed committee room where airline executives, civil rights advocates, and passenger rights attorneys prepared to testify about systematic discrimination that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The witness table reflected the scope of an investigation that had grown far beyond a single incident on Flight 847. David Rivera sat alongside the CEOs of United American and Delta Airlines, all of whom had been subpoenaed to explain their company's handling of discrimination complaints and their corporate cultures that enabled bias to flourish unchallenged. Dr. Aisha Johnson, the pediatrician who had been removed from her seat by Patricia Hawkins 3 months before the Rivera incident, represented dozens of passengers whose experiences had been uncovered during the federal investigation. Her testimony would demonstrate that Marcus's assault was part of a systematic pattern rather than an isolated incident. But the most compelling witness was Marcus Rivera himself, now 18, and preparing for his freshman year at Columbia University. The young man who had maintained his dignity while being slapped and humiliated in front of 37 silent witnesses, would provide the human face for legislative reforms that could reshape how airlines treated millions of passengers for generations to come. This is the moment that changes everything. An 18-year-old who was assaulted for being black in first class is about to address the United States Congress. If you believe young voices can change the world, comment. Young voices matter below and subscribe, because his testimony will give you chills and restore your faith in justice. Mr. Rivera, Chairman DeFazio, began, his voice carrying the weight of historical significance. Can you tell the committee what happened on Flight 847 and how it has affected your understanding of civil rights and institutional accountability in America? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice clear and steady as he addressed the packed hearing room filled with cameras, reporters, and advocates who understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment in civil rights history. Congressman DeFazio, what happened to me on Flight 847 wasn't unique or unprecedented. It was just recorded and shared widely enough that it couldn't be ignored or covered up like thousands of similar incidents. For every video that goes viral, there are hundreds of cases of discrimination that happen in silence, to people who don't have the resources, platform, or family support to seek accountability through federal courts and congressional hearings. He paused, his eyes moving across the hearing room to meet the gaze of airline executives who were about to be held accountable for decades of institutional failure. My experience revealed how systematic discrimination operates behind facades of professionalism and customer service protocols. The flight attendant who assaulted me had been consistently rewarded for similar behavior throughout her 25-year career. She genuinely believed she was following unwritten, but clearly understood rules about who belongs in premium seating. The passengers who watched it happen stayed silent because they assumed authority figures must have legitimate reasons for their actions, even when those actions violated basic human dignity. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, maintaining comfortable segregation while providing plausible deniability about discriminatory intent. My assault was the inevitable result of institutional choices made over decades to prioritize profit margins over civil rights. Marcus Rivera just delivered one of the most powerful testimonies in congressional history, and he's only 18 years old. He didn't just describe what happened, he explained how systematic racism actually operates. If his analysis gives you hope for the future, comment, future leader, and subscribe, because this young man is going to change America. Marcus's testimony was carried live on major news networks and streamed by millions of viewers who recognized the broader implications of his experience for civil rights enforcement across American society. This wasn't just about airline policies. It was about how institutional racism operated throughout American institutions, hiding behind professional courtesy and bureaucratic procedures while causing real harm to real people. The airline executives who followed Marcus to the witness table struggled visibly to explain how their company's training programs, performance evaluations, and complaint procedures had enabled the systematic discrimination that federal investigators had documented with devastating precision. United CEO Scott Kirby admitted that his airline had failed catastrophically to address passenger concerns about discriminatory treatment and committed to comprehensive reforms, including mandatory bias training, transparent complaint procedures, and complete restructuring of crew evaluation systems. American Airlines CEO Doug Parker acknowledged systematic deficiencies in how we evaluate employee performance and resolve passenger complaints, and announced the creation of an independent passenger rights office with unprecedented authority to investigate discrimination allegations and impose disciplinary measures up to and including termination. But it was Delta CEO Ed Bastian's testimony that proved most significant for industry-wide reform and corporate accountability. Rather than minimizing his company's problems or promising incremental improvements. Bastian admitted that the aviation industry had systematically failed to protect the civil rights of passengers who don't fit certain demographic expectations, and had created corporate cultures that enabled discrimination to flourish. The Marcus Rivera incident forced us to examine practices that we had accepted as normal business operations for decades. Bastian testified with uncommon honesty. What we discovered was institutional bias operating at every level of our organization, from hiring and training to performance evaluation and complaint resolution. We are implementing comprehensive reforms, not because federal regulations require them, but because our moral obligations and business interests demand them. Did you catch that a major airline CEO just admitted on live television that his entire industry has been systematically discriminating against passengers for decades? If you think this admission changes everything, comment truth finally told below and subscribe, because accountability is finally here. The congressional hearings generated unprecedented media attention and sustained public pressure for comprehensive reform that extended far beyond aviation. But the real transformation was occurring in airports and aircraft cabins across the country, where crew members and passengers were beginning to recognize and challenge discriminatory behavior that had previously been ignored, accepted, or actively encouraged. Jennifer Torres, the former Skyline Airways flight attendant, who had cooperated with federal investigators, had become one of the most powerful advocates for industry reform and institutional change. Speaking at training conferences and employee meetings across the country, Torres shared her experience of witnessing Patricia's assault on Marcus and her own failure to intervene, despite knowing it was morally and legally wrong. I stayed silent because I was explicitly taught that crew unity was more important than passenger rights, Torres explained during a presentation to flight attendants from multiple airlines. I was systematically trained to defer to senior colleagues, even when their behavior clearly violated company policies and federal law. That training nearly made me complicit in a hate crime, and it took federal investigators to help me understand that professional courtesy cannot override basic human decency. Torres's presentations were particularly effective because she spoke as an insider who intimately understood the cultural pressures and professional incentives that enabled discriminatory behavior to flourish throughout the industry. Her message to fellow crew members was unambiguous: silence in the face of discrimination wasn't neutral or professional. It was collaboration with institutional racism. The legislative response to the congressional hearings was swift, comprehensive, and remarkably bipartisan. Senator Warren's passenger rights reform bill passed the Senate with overwhelming support, including the Marcus Rivera amendment requiring airlines to publicly report all discrimination complaints and their resolution. The House passed even stronger legislation with enhanced provisions for federal oversight of airline operations and crew training programs. President Biden signed the Aviation Civil Rights Act into law during a ceremony attended by Marcus Rivera, his father, and dozens of other passengers who had experienced discriminatory treatment by airline personnel over the years. The legislation established the strongest passenger rights protections in American history, including mandatory bias training for all crew members, standardized complaint procedures with federal oversight, and substantial financial penalties for discriminatory treatment. But the law's most significant provision was the creation of an independent Aviation Civil Rights Commission with unprecedented authority to investigate discrimination complaints, impose sanctions on airlines that violated passenger rights, and recommend additional reforms based on emerging patterns of discriminatory behavior across the industry. Marcus Rivera was appointed to serve on the commission as a passenger advocate, bringing the perspective of someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand and understood its impact on travelers from marginalized communities. At 18, he became one of the youngest federal appointees in American history. This commission isn't about punishment or revenge, Marcus explained during his confirmation hearing. It's about prevention and protection. We want to create an aviation system where every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or economic status. That requires ongoing vigilance, continuous improvement, and the recognition that civil rights protection is a shared responsibility rather than an individual burden. At 18 years old, Marcus Rivera just became one of the most powerful people in aviation. From being slapped in seat 1B to serving on a federal commission. If that isn't the definition of turning injustice into justice, what is? Comment justice transformed. If this inspires you, and subscribe, because this young man's journey is just beginning. The economic impact of the comprehensive reforms was substantial but manageable for airlines that embraced meaningful change. Bias training programs required significant initial investments, but they proved far less expensive than the class action lawsuits, federal fines, and reputation damage that had emerged from the systematic discrimination exposed by the Rivera case. Transparent complaint procedures required additional administrative resources and independent oversight, but they also provided early warning systems for identifying problematic employees before their behavior escalated to criminal assault or federal civil rights violations. Most importantly, the reforms created genuine competitive advantages for airlines that authentically embraced inclusive customer service and civil rights compliance. Skyline Airways, under David Rivera's transformational leadership, had become the industry standard for passenger rights protection and corporate accountability. Their comprehensive reforms had initially cost over $50 million to implement, but they had also generated unprecedented customer loyalty, positive media coverage, and investor confidence worth far more than the financial investment required. The company's stock price, which had dropped 18% immediately after the Flight 847 incident, had not only recovered, but reached record highs as investors recognized the long-term competitive advantages of being perceived as the most passenger-friendly and ethically operated major airline in the industry. Other carriers that had been slower to embrace comprehensive reform faced ongoing scrutiny from the Aviation Civil Rights Commission, negative publicity from passenger advocacy groups, and systematic boycotts from travelers who had become much more conscious of corporate civil rights records when making purchasing decisions. The market was systematically rewarding companies that protected passenger rights while punishing those that maintained discriminatory practices, creating powerful economic incentives for institutional change that extended far beyond legal compliance. As the first anniversary of the Flight 847 incident approached, Marcus Rivera reflected on how 7 words in a text message had transformed an entire industry and sparked a national conversation about systematic discrimination, bystander responsibility, and institutional accountability that extended far beyond commercial aviation. Patricia Hawkins was serving an 18-month federal sentence for assault and civil rights violations, but her individual punishment was less significant than the systematic changes her actions had inadvertently triggered throughout American society. Airlines across the country had implemented comprehensive bias training programs, diversified their crew assignments, established transparent complaint procedures, and created independent oversight mechanisms that provided meaningful accountability for discriminatory behavior. Federal oversight ensured that reforms were implemented consistently and maintained permanently, rather than abandoned once media attention faded or corporate leadership changed. Most importantly, passengers themselves had become more aware of their rights, more willing to speak up when they witnessed discriminatory treatment, and more likely to hold airlines accountable through their purchasing decisions and public advocacy. The culture of silent complicity that had enabled discrimination to flourish for decades was being systematically replaced by a recognition that everyone had both legal and moral obligations to challenge injustice when they encountered it in airports, aircraft, and society more broadly. The Flight 847 passenger who provided the most powerful example of this cultural transformation was Robert Chen, the technology journalist whose video had triggered the viral response that made Marcus's assault impossible to ignore or cover up. In the year since posting that recording, Chen had become a prominent advocate for bystander intervention, corporate accountability, and the responsibility of witnesses to protect civil rights rather than simply document violations after the fact. Recording the incident was important for legal accountability and federal prosecution, Chen explained during a keynote address at a civil rights conference. But my failure to intervene in real time made me complicit in Marcus's humiliation and assault. We all have legal and moral obligations to act when we witness injustice, not just to document it for social media or hope someone else will take responsibility. Chen's presentation included footage from a recent flight where he had successfully intervened when a crew member began questioning a passenger's right to sit in premium seating based on appearance and demographic assumptions. The video demonstrated how one person's willingness to speak up could prevent discrimination from escalating to humiliation assault or civil rights violations. Robert Chen transformed from a silent bystander to an active defender of civil rights. That transformation is possible for all of us. If you commit to speaking up, next time you witness injustice, comment, "I will speak up," and subscribe, because change starts with individual courage. As Marcus Rivera prepared to begin his sophomore year at Columbia University, majoring in public policy with a concentration in civil rights law, he received regular updates on the ongoing impact of the reforms triggered by his traumatic experience on Flight 847. Discrimination complaints were being resolved more quickly, fairly, and transparently than ever before in aviation history. Crew members were receiving comprehensive training on recognizing and preventing biased behavior. Passengers were increasingly likely to speak up when they witnessed problematic treatment of fellow travelers. But Marcus also understood, with unusual maturity, that institutional change required sustained effort, ongoing vigilance, and continuous improvement, rather than one-time reforms or temporary attention to civil rights issues. The Aviation Civil Rights Commission continued to identify problems that needed attention across multiple carriers and industry sectors. Some airlines remained more committed to meaningful change than others, and the broader challenge of addressing systematic discrimination in American society extended far beyond transportation into housing, employment, education, healthcare, and criminal justice. The text message Marcus had sent from seat 32F. She slapped me. Seat 1B to 32F had accomplished far more than he could have imagined when he typed those 7 words with trembling fingers and justified anger. It had exposed systematic discrimination throughout commercial aviation. It had triggered comprehensive federal legislation and regulatory reform. It had created new institutions for protecting passenger rights and civil rights more broadly. And it had sparked a national conversation about dignity discrimination, institutional accountability, and the cost of remaining silent when witnessing injustice. But perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that individual courage and family support could create catalysts for systematic change that protected millions of people who would never know Marcus Rivera's name, but would benefit from the institutional reforms his dignity had made possible. The ripple effects from Flight 847 were still spreading throughout American society, creating waves of change that would influence how institutions treated individuals for decades to come. And Marcus Rivera, the young man whose quiet strength had started it all, was committed to ensuring that those changes created lasting protection for human dignity and civil rights that would survive changes in political leadership, corporate management, and public attention. The work of building a more just and inclusive society was never finished, but the foundation had been strengthened immeasurably by one teenager's refusal to accept discrimination as normal and one father's determination to ensure that his son's humiliation became a catalyst for institutional transformation rather than just another forgotten injustice. The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles had witnessed thousands of criminal trials over the decades. But United States vs. Patricia Hawkins represented something unprecedented in aviation law, the first federal prosecution of airline personnel for civil rights violations related to systematic passenger discrimination. As Assistant U.S. Attorney, Janet Martinez rose to deliver her opening statement. She faced a packed courtroom filled with civil rights advocates, airline industry representatives, journalists, and ordinary citizens who understood they were witnessing a defining moment in American civil rights enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Martinez began her voice carrying the authority that came with prosecuting cases that would reshape entire industries and redefine corporate accountability. This trial is about more than one flight attendant's decision to assault a 16-year-old passenger. It's about systematic discrimination that has operated in commercial aviation for decades, hiding behind professional courtesy and customer service protocols while violating the fundamental civil rights of millions of American travelers. She activated a large screen showing the now famous video of Patricia's assault on Marcus Rivera, 90 seconds of footage that had generated over 50 million views across social media platforms and triggered congressional hearings on institutional discrimination in commercial aviation. This is the trial that will determine whether assaulting passengers for being black is a crime or just poor customer service. If you think there should be real consequences for discrimination, comment "Justice Now" below and subscribe, because Patricia's excuses are about to be destroyed by facts. You will see Patricia Hawkins systematically question this young man's right to sit in his assigned seat, based solely on his appearance and her assumptions about who belongs in first class. You will watch her escalate from suspicion to interrogation to physical assault, all because she determined that a well-behaved black teenager couldn't possibly afford premium seating. And you will witness 37 passengers remain silent while a minor was humiliated and physically assaulted for asserting his constitutional rights. The prosecution's case was overwhelming in its clarity and devastating in its comprehensiveness. Video evidence from multiple angles showed Patricia's discriminatory questioning her escalating aggression, despite Marcus's calm responses and the moment her palm connected with his cheek, in a sound that had echoed through American consciousness for months. Witness testimony from passengers and crew members corroborated every detail of the incident, while revealing the systematic nature of discrimination that had made Patricia's behavior seem routine rather than shocking to those who witnessed it. Aircraft security footage provided additional context, showing Marcus's consistently calm and respectful behavior throughout the confrontation. But Martinez's most legally damaging evidence concerned Patricia's documented pattern of discriminatory behavior over her 25-year career with Skyline Airways. Dr. Aisha Johnson testified about her own experience being removed from first class by Patricia just 3 months before the Marcus Rivera incident, describing virtually identical treatment that had been quietly covered up with confidentiality agreements and travel vouchers. 2 additional passengers described similar encounters where Patricia had questioned their right to premium seating based on their appearance, ethnicity, and her assumptions about their economic status and social background. This wasn't an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment, or a misunderstanding about passenger behavior. Martinez told the jury during her methodical closing argument. Patricia Hawkins engaged in systematic racial profiling throughout her career, and her employers consistently rewarded her for it. She received performance evaluations explicitly praising her ability to maintain appropriate standards in premium cabins. She was promoted to head flight attendant positions, based partly on her documented success in managing difficult passengers and maintaining proper cabin atmosphere. Martinez paused to let the implications sink in. She was trained, supervised, and rewarded by an industry that prioritized the comfort of some travelers over the civil rights of others. Her assault on Marcus Rivera was the predictable escalation of discriminatory behavior that had been institutionally encouraged rather than corrected. Prosecutor Martinez just proved that Patricia wasn't a rogue employee. She was following exactly what her industry trained her to do. The system created her, rewarded her, and then abandoned her when she got caught. If you think the whole system needs to be held accountable, comment, prosecute the system, and subscribe because this is bigger than one person. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Michael Ross, faced the legally impossible task of explaining away high-definition video evidence that showed his client physically striking a minor passenger who had committed no offense other than asserting his right to sit in his assigned seat. Ross's strategy focused desperately on portraying Patricia as a dedicated employee who had made an error in judgment under stressful circumstances. But this narrative collapsed completely when prosecutors introduced comprehensive evidence of her previous discriminatory conduct and the systematic institutional support it had received. "My client made a serious mistake," Ross argued during his closing statement, his voice carrying the resignation of someone defending the indefensible. "She mishandled a challenging passenger interaction and made physical contact that she immediately regretted. But this was not a hate crime motivated by racial animus. This was not systematic discrimination. This was an experienced professional who exercised poor judgment during what she perceived as a security situation." But even as Ross spoke, he understood that his client's fate had been sealed by the comprehensive evidence of institutional discrimination that federal prosecutors had methodically assembled over months of investigation. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: assault, federal civil rights violations, and conspiracy to deprive Marcus Rivera of his constitutional rights. Patricia sat motionless as the verdicts were read, her 25-year career in aviation, ending with federal felony convictions that would follow her for the rest of her life. Judge Maria Gonzalez, a Clinton appointee, known for her careful attention to civil rights law and institutional accountability, addressed Patricia directly during the sentencing hearing held 3 weeks later in a courtroom packed with civil rights advocates, aviation industry representatives, and media covering every word. "Ms. Hawkins, you have been found guilty of assaulting a minor passenger because you determined that his skin color made him unsuitable for first-class seating. Your actions were captured on video and witnessed by dozens of passengers who will remember this incident for the rest of their lives. But what makes this case particularly troubling is the comprehensive evidence showing that your discriminatory behavior was not aberrant, but systematic, not individual, but institutional, not discouraged, but actively rewarded by your employers." Judge Gonzalez is about to deliver a sentence that will change how every airline employee thinks about discrimination. If you think Patricia deserves prison time for assaulting a child, comment prison time below and subscribe because justice is about to be served. Judge Gonzalez sentenced Patricia to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release that included mandatory community service with civil rights organizations and comprehensive education about the history and impact of institutional racism in American society. The sentence was within federal guidelines, but represented the harshest penalty ever imposed on airline personnel for passenger discrimination, reflecting both the severity of the crime and the need to send an unmistakable message to the aviation industry about the consequences of violating civil rights. This sentence reflects not only your individual culpability, Judge Gonzalez explained, but the urgent need to send a clear message to the aviation industry and American society that discriminatory treatment of passengers will result in serious legal consequences. Your actions violated federal law, professional standards, and basic human decency. The sentence must reflect the gravity of those violations and the institutional changes necessary to prevent future incidents. But Patricia's criminal conviction was only one component of the comprehensive legal consequences flowing from the Flight 847 incident. The civil lawsuit filed by the Rivera family against Skyline Airways had expanded into the most significant challenge to discriminatory practices in the aviation industry's history. Lisa Park, the civil rights attorney representing the Rivera family, had assembled a case that went far beyond individual damages to address systematic problems in airline operations that had enabled discrimination to flourish for decades while generating massive profits from institutionally biased service delivery. The lawsuit included claims for assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil rights violations, corporate negligence in training and supervising employees, and systematic discrimination that created hostile environments for passengers from marginalized communities. This case has never been about monetary compensation, Park explained during a press conference outside the federal courthouse following Patricia's sentencing. It's about institutional accountability and systematic change. Skyline Airways created a corporate culture that consistently rewarded discriminatory behavior while providing legal cover for institutional bias. Patricia Hawkins didn't act alone. She acted within a system that enabled, encouraged, and profited from her conduct. Lisa Park just explained why this lawsuit is about changing systems, not just getting money. The goal is making sure no other family goes through what the Riveras experienced. If you think corporate accountability matters more than cash settlements, comment, change the system and subscribe, because this lawyer is fighting for all of us. The discovery process in the civil lawsuit had revealed internal communications and training materials that provided devastating evidence of systematic bias throughout airline operations. Email threads between crew members contained explicit references to passenger demographics and institutionalized assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. Performance evaluations consistently praised employees for maintaining appropriate standards and ensuring passenger comfort without defining what those standards entailed or how they should be applied fairly across different demographic groups. Most legally damaging were comprehensive statistical analyses showing discriminatory patterns in how passenger complaints were handled over multiple years. Complaints from passengers of color were systematically more likely to be dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts, while similar complaints from white passengers received thorough investigation and meaningful resolution. The data revealed institutional bias operating at every level of customer service operations, from initial complaint intake through final resolution and follow-up customer relations. David Rivera's response to the lawsuit had been unprecedented in corporate litigation and civil rights enforcement. Rather than fighting the allegations or attempting to minimize legal and financial exposure, Rivera had instructed his legal team to cooperate fully with the investigation and accept complete responsibility for the systematic failures that had enabled discrimination to flourish within his company. We're not going to spend millions of dollars on attorneys trying to defend behavior that is legally and morally indefensible, Rivera announced during a shareholders' meeting, where he explained his litigation strategy with unusual transparency and accountability. Patricia Hawkins assaulted my son because our training programs, supervision protocols, and corporate culture made that assault seem reasonable and professionally appropriate to her. We bear institutional responsibility for creating the conditions that enable discrimination, and we're going to accept that responsibility while implementing comprehensive reforms to prevent future incidents. The settlement agreement reached between the Rivera family and Skyline Airways included monetary damages that were donated entirely to civil rights organizations working on transportation equity and institutional reform. But the agreement's most significant provisions concerned systematic changes that went far beyond federal requirements and established new industry standards for corporate accountability. Skyline Airways committed to comprehensive bias training for all employees, transparent complaint procedures with independent oversight, diversified hiring, and promotion practices, and continuous statistical monitoring of passenger treatment across all demographic groups. The agreement also established an independent civil rights compliance office with unprecedented authority to investigate discrimination complaints, impose disciplinary measures up to and including termination, and recommend policy changes to prevent institutional bias. These reforms create the strongest passenger rights protections in the aviation industry's history, Park explained during the settlement announcement. But more importantly, they demonstrate how corporate accountability can drive meaningful institutional change when companies choose transparency and reform over denial and legal maneuvering. The Rivera family just donated their entire settlement to civil rights organizations instead of keeping the money. That's what fighting for principle instead of profit looks like. If you think this family deserves our respect, comment, respect below, and subscribe, because their sacrifice is changing America. The legal consequences extended far beyond Skyline Airways to other airlines whose practices were being scrutinized by federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and congressional oversight committees with unprecedented access to internal company records and communications. Class action lawsuits had been filed against United American and Delta Airlines, alleging systematic discrimination in passenger treatment based on race, ethnicity, religion, age, and economic status. The lawsuits relied heavily on evidence and legal precedents established in the Rivera case, including statistical methodologies for demonstrating discriminatory patterns and expert testimony about institutional bias in customer service operations. But they also incorporated new evidence of discriminatory practices that had been uncovered through the expanded federal investigation, creating a comprehensive legal challenge to industry practices that had operated with impunity for decades. United Airlines faced particular legal scrutiny due to several high-profile incidents involving the removal of passengers from aircraft under circumstances that appeared discriminatory, but had been handled through confidential settlements that prevented public discussion of the incidents or institutional reforms implemented to address them. But the Rivera case had fundamentally changed the legal landscape around airline discrimination, making it politically and legally impossible for carriers to quietly resolve complaints without addressing systematic problems that enabled discriminatory treatment. Federal prosecutors were now actively investigating incidents that would previously have been handled as internal disciplinary matters or civil settlements. Civil rights attorneys were sharing information and coordinating legal strategies across multiple cases. Congressional oversight committees were demanding transparency about settlement agreements and requiring public reporting of institutional reform implementation. Captain Frank Mueller, the pilot who had failed to intervene when discriminatory behavior was occurring in his aircraft, faced professional consequences that reflected the expanded understanding of institutional accountability and bystander responsibility in civil rights violations. The Federal Aviation Administration suspended his pilot's license for 6 months and required comprehensive additional training on crew resource management and passenger rights before reinstating his certification to operate commercial aircraft. Mueller's discipline was legally significant because it established that aviation professionals had affirmative obligations to prevent discrimination, even when they weren't directly involved in discriminatory conduct. The FAA's action sent an unmistakable message that supervisory personnel could not remain passive when civil rights violations were occurring under their authority and operational control. Captain Mueller failed in his fundamental duty to ensure that all passengers were treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background, explained FAA Administrator Steve Dixon during a press conference announcing the disciplinary action. Airline captains have ultimate authority over aircraft operations, and that authority includes the legal and professional responsibility to prevent crew members from violating passenger rights, federal law, and basic human decency. Even the pilot who didn't directly discriminate got punished because he had the power to stop it and chose not to. That's how you hold entire systems accountable, instead of just blaming individual bad actors. If you think everyone with power has responsibility to protect others, comment. Power means responsibility and subscribe, because accountability is spreading. Jennifer Torres, the junior flight attendant who had cooperated with federal investigators and testified about institutional problems that enabled discrimination, received a commendation from the Department of Transportation for her courage in exposing systematic failures and her commitment to passenger rights over professional convenience. Her cooperation had been crucial to understanding how discriminatory behavior was normalized within airline culture, and how junior employees were systematically discouraged from challenging problematic conduct by senior colleagues, even when that conduct violated company policies and federal law. Torres had initially left the aviation industry after testifying in Patricia's criminal trial, but her experience had made her a powerful advocate for workplace reforms that encouraged employees to report discrimination and other legal violations without fear of retaliation or career damage. She now worked for a nonprofit organization that provided training on bystander intervention and institutional accountability, helping employees across multiple industries understand their legal and moral obligations to protect civil rights in workplace settings. I learned that staying silent in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice, regardless of your intentions or your fear of professional consequences. Torres explained during a presentation to airline employees about recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. Professional courtesy and crew unity are important values, but they cannot override our legal and moral obligations to treat all passengers with dignity and respect. When we witness discrimination and remain silent, we become part of the system that enables it. As the comprehensive legal consequences from Flight 847 continued to unfold across the aviation industry and American society more broadly, Marcus Rivera had become one of the nation's most prominent advocates for passenger rights reform and institutional accountability in civil rights enforcement. His testimony during Patricia's criminal trial had been particularly powerful because it focused not just on his individual experience of assault and humiliation, but on the systematic problems that had made his treatment seem routine and acceptable to the people who witnessed it without intervening. The criminal conviction and civil settlement are important for establishing legal accountability. Marcus explained during a speech at Howard University Law School, where he was being recruited for admission after completing his undergraduate degree at Columbia. But the real victory is the systematic reform that prevents other families from experiencing what mine did. Laws and policies only matter if they're enforced consistently and fairly across all communities and institutions. Marcus's experience had convinced him to pursue a career in civil rights law, focusing on institutional discrimination in transportation, housing, employment, and education. He understood that the Flight 847 incident represented a much broader pattern of systematic discrimination that required sustained legal and political pressure to address effectively and permanently. The legal consequences flowing from Patricia Hawkins's assault on Marcus Rivera had fundamentally reshaped how courts, prosecutors, and civil rights attorneys approached discrimination in commercial aviation and other sectors of American society. What had previously been dismissed as customer service disputes or personality conflicts were now recognized as potential federal crimes requiring serious legal consequences and institutional reform. But perhaps most importantly, the comprehensive legal accountability had created powerful economic and professional incentives for airlines and other companies to address discriminatory practices before they escalated to criminal conduct or civil rights violations. The reforms implemented by Skyline Airways and other carriers represented proactive efforts to prevent discrimination rather than reactive responses to negative publicity or legal liability. As Marcus boarded his first flight since the incident, traveling from New York to Atlanta for a summer internship with the Southern Poverty Law Center, he reflected on how legal accountability had transformed his traumatic experience into a catalyst for institutional change that would protect millions of passengers for generations to come. The young man, who had been slapped and humiliated for asserting his right to premium seating, was now working to ensure that civil rights protections extended to every person who traveled through America's transportation systems and participated in American society. The legal consequences had been swift, comprehensive, and permanent. But their true measure would be whether they prevented other passengers from experiencing the discrimination and humiliation that had made Flight 847 a defining moment in American civil rights history and institutional accountability. Justice had been served, but the work of protecting human dignity continued with each flight, each passenger interaction, and each opportunity to choose inclusion over exclusion in the ongoing struggle for civil rights in America. 18 months after Patricia Hawkins struck Marcus Rivera in the first-class cabin of Flight 847, the transformation of American aviation was visible in countless small moments that collectively represented a revolution in how passengers were treated regardless of their appearance, background, or assumptions about their economic status. At LaGuardia Airport in New York, a young Latina woman in casual clothes boarded a Delta flight and took her seat in first class without receiving a single questioning glance from crew members who had been comprehensively trained to recognize and prevent discriminatory behavior. At O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, an elderly Muslim man wearing traditional dress was greeted warmly by United Airlines staff and assisted to his premium seat with the same courtesy and respect extended to every passenger regardless of their religion, ethnicity, or cultural background. These routine interactions, unremarkable in their normalcy and dignity, represented the success of comprehensive reforms that had reshaped how airlines approached customer service, civil rights, and institutional accountability. The mandatory training programs, transparent complaint procedures, and federal oversight created by the Aviation Civil Rights Act had transformed industry culture in ways that went far beyond policy changes or legal compliance requirements. Marcus Rivera, now a sophomore at Columbia University, studying public policy with a concentration in civil rights law, monitored these changes through his position on the Aviation Civil Rights Commission and his ongoing work with passenger advocacy organizations. The 18-year-old who had maintained his dignity while being assaulted for asserting his civil rights had become one of the nation's most influential voices on transportation equity and institutional reform. But Marcus had never forgotten the fear he'd felt that day, the way his hands had trembled as Patricia Hawkins questioned his right to exist in a space he belonged. Even now, boarding aircraft sometimes brought back that familiar anxiety, not because he doubted his rights, but because dignity once stripped away leaves invisible scars that heal slowly. Marcus Rivera went from being humiliated in first class to becoming one of the most powerful voices for civil rights in America. But success doesn't erase trauma. It transforms it into purpose. If you believe pain can become power, comment Pain into Purpose below and subscribe, because his journey shows how survivors become leaders. The real measure of our success isn't the absence of viral videos, Marcus explained during his quarterly report to the Aviation Civil Rights Commission, his voice carrying the wisdom that comes from experiencing injustice and working to prevent others from enduring similar treatment. It's the presence of dignity in every passenger interaction. When crew members treat every traveler with respect, regardless of their appearance or background, when passengers feel empowered to speak up if they witness discriminatory behavior, when airlines prioritize civil rights over customer convenience, that's when we know the reforms are creating lasting change rather than just legal compliance. The statistical evidence supported Marcus's cautious optimism about institutional progress. Discrimination complaints to airlines had decreased by 67% since implementation of comprehensive reforms, while complaint resolution satisfaction rates had increased to over 90% across all major carriers. More significantly, from a civil rights perspective, demographic analysis showed that premium seating had become substantially more diverse, as discriminatory barriers were systematically eliminated and inclusive practices were implemented throughout the industry. David Rivera's leadership had been crucial to this transformation, but the process had revealed the personal cost of choosing transparency over damage control. The CEO, who had grounded an entire flight to protect his son's dignity, had faced months of criticism from shareholders, industry analysts, and board members who questioned whether his emotional response to a family crisis had compromised his business judgment. We discovered that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was economically destructive and legally catastrophic, Rivera explained during a keynote address at the International Aviation Conference, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had successfully transformed both a company and an industry. When passengers feel welcomed and respected, they become loyal customers who recommend our services to others. When employees are trained to recognize and prevent bias, they provide better customer service to everyone. When corporations prioritize dignity and inclusion, they attract the best talent and generate sustainable competitive advantages. But Rivera had also learned that the cost of doing the right thing wasn't just financial. The stress of the crisis had strained his marriage, affected his health, and forced him to confront his own assumptions about the discrimination his son faced regularly. Being a successful Black CEO hadn't protected Marcus from racism. It had just given him a more powerful father to respond when racism revealed itself so publicly. David Rivera risked everything, his company, his career, his reputation, to fight for his son's dignity. That's what real leadership looks like when it costs you something. If you think protecting your family's honor is worth any price, comment family honor and subscribe, because this father proved love is stronger than profit. Skyline Airways' financial performance had ultimately validated Rivera's approach, but not without significant short-term costs. The company's stock price had reached record highs as investors recognized the competitive advantages of being perceived as the most passenger-friendly and ethically operated major airline in the industry. Customer satisfaction scores consistently exceeded industry averages, while employee retention rates improved, as crew members took pride in working for an organization genuinely committed to civil rights, rather than just legal compliance and public relations management. But the transformation extended far beyond financial metrics to fundamental changes in corporate culture and employee behavior that would outlast any individual CEO or management team. Jennifer Torres, who had left Skyline Airways after testifying in Patricia Hawkins' criminal trial, returned to the company 18 months later as Director of Passenger Rights Compliance, overseeing implementation of the comprehensive reforms that had emerged from her courage in exposing institutional failures. The company I returned to was completely different from the one I left, Torres explained during a staff meeting with flight attendants and customer service representatives from across the airline's operations. Discrimination isn't just prohibited by policy, it's become culturally unthinkable. Employees understand that treating passengers with dignity isn't optional customer service or legal compliance. It's the absolute foundation of everything we do as an organization. Torres's new position represented one of the most significant institutional changes created by the Flight 847 reforms. Every major airline now employed passenger rights compliance officers with independent authority to investigate discrimination. Complaints discipline employees who violated civil rights and recommend policy changes to prevent future incidents. These positions were staffed by civil rights attorneys and community advocates rather than company employees, ensuring complete independence from corporate pressure to minimize problems, protect airline reputations, or prioritize business interests over passenger rights. The compliance officers reported directly to the Aviation Civil Rights Commission, rather than airline management, providing federal oversight of industry practices that had previously been self-regulated with minimal external accountability or transparency. This structure ensured that reforms were implemented consistently across all carriers and maintained permanently, rather than abandoned as marketing gestures designed to generate positive publicity until public attention moved elsewhere. The airlines now have independent civil rights officers who can't be fired for doing their job. That's how you build real accountability into systems, instead of just hoping people will do the right thing. If you think this structural change matters, comment, structure matters, and subscribe, because reform that lasts requires more than good intentions. Patricia Hawkins herself had become an unexpected advocate for the comprehensive reforms that emerged from her criminal conviction and federal imprisonment. During her 18-month sentence, she had participated in educational programs about civil rights history and institutional racism that helped her understand how her individual prejudices had been shaped and reinforced by larger cultural and organizational forces throughout her career. Upon her release from federal prison, Patricia began speaking at airline training conferences and employee meetings, sharing her experience as someone whose discriminatory behavior had been enabled and rewarded by industry practices that normalized bias against passengers from marginalized communities. I genuinely believed I was a good person who treated everyone fairly and professionally, Patricia explained during a presentation to flight attendants at American Airlines' comprehensive training facility. I didn't realize that my definition of appropriate passengers was shaped by racial assumptions that I had never examined or questioned. I didn't understand that trusting my instincts about who belonged where meant trusting biases that had been constructed by a society and industry with a long history of systematic discrimination. Patricia's presentations were particularly effective because she spoke as someone who had lost everything: career reputation, freedom, financial security, as a result of discriminatory behavior that she had previously considered professional, appropriate, and consistent with industry standards. Her message to current airline employees was unambiguous. Bias training and civil rights compliance weren't abstract requirements imposed by federal regulators, but practical necessities for anyone who wanted to build a sustainable career in aviation without risking criminal prosecution. But Patricia's transformation also revealed the human cost of institutional racism for those who perpetrate it. Her 25 years of successful discrimination had left her isolated, bitter, and ultimately unemployable in the industry she had served. The system that had created and rewarded her behavior had abandoned her the moment it became legally and financially convenient to do so. Patricia Hawkins lost everything because she was trained to discriminate and then abandoned when discrimination became expensive. She's both perpetrator and victim of a system that destroys everyone it touches. If you think institutional racism hurts everyone, comment "Racism hurts all" and subscribe, because healing requires understanding. The broader impact of the Flight 847 reforms had extended far beyond commercial aviation to other transportation sectors and customer service industries throughout American society. Amtrak had implemented comprehensive bias training for all employees after several high-profile incidents involving discriminatory treatment of passengers that echoed the patterns documented in aviation. Greyhound had established passenger rights compliance procedures similar to those created in the airline industry. Hotels, restaurants, and retail establishments were adopting inclusive customer service practices inspired by aviation industry reforms and the legal precedents established in federal court. Most significantly, the Flight 847 incident had sparked a sustained national conversation about bystander intervention and the legal and moral responsibility of witnesses to challenge discrimination when they encountered it in their daily lives. The 37 passengers who had remained silent during Marcus's assault had become symbols of how ordinary people's inaction enabled systematic injustice to flourish in American society. But they had also become catalysts for change in their own communities and professional environments. Robert Chen, the technology journalist whose video documentation had triggered the viral response to Marcus's assault, had become one of the most prominent advocates for bystander intervention training and witness accountability in civil rights violations. His presentations at conferences, universities, and corporate training programs focused on the legal and moral obligations of people who witnessed discriminatory behavior in workplace, educational, and public accommodation settings. Recording the incident was important for legal accountability and federal prosecution, Chen explained during a TED Talk that had been viewed over 2 million times. But my failure to intervene in real time made me complicit in Marcus's humiliation and assault. We all have legal and moral obligations to act when we witness injustice, not just to document it for social media or assume someone else will take responsibility for protecting civil rights. Chen's advocacy had contributed to widespread adoption of bystander intervention training in workplaces, schools, and community organizations across the country. The programs taught people how to recognize discriminatory behavior, safely intervene in situations involving bias or harassment, and report incidents to appropriate authorities without fear of retaliation or legal consequences. The training programs were particularly important in transportation settings, where diverse groups of people interacted in confined spaces under stressful circumstances that could quickly escalate into discriminatory treatment or civil rights violations. Airlines had made bystander intervention training mandatory for all employees, while many carriers also provided voluntary programs for passengers who wanted to learn how to respond effectively to discrimination they might witness during travel. Robert Chen transformed his guilt about staying silent into a mission to teach others how to intervene when they witness discrimination. That's what taking responsibility looks like, not just saying sorry, but changing your behavior and helping others do better. Comment: real accountability. If you respect his transformation, and subscribe, because we all need to learn from our failures. Judge Margaret Washington. The federal judge, who had remained silent during Marcus's assault, but later provided crucial testimony during the investigation, had become a leading advocate for legal reforms that strengthened protections against discrimination in transportation and other public accommodations. Her judicial experience and moral authority provided valuable perspective on how civil rights laws could be strengthened and more effectively enforced to prevent future incidents. The Flight 847 incident revealed significant gaps in our legal framework that allowed discrimination to flourish behind professional facades and customer service protocols, Judge Washington explained during congressional testimony on proposed civil rights legislation. We need stronger laws, more aggressive enforcement, clearer obligations for bystanders who witness discriminatory behavior, and meaningful consequences for institutions that enable or ignore civil rights violations. The legislative reforms inspired by Flight 847 had indeed strengthened federal civil rights protections far beyond the aviation sector. The Marcus Rivera Civil Rights Enhancement Act had expanded protections against discrimination in hotels, restaurants, retail establishments, and other public accommodations. The legislation also established federal funding for bystander intervention training and created substantial penalties for businesses that failed to address discriminatory behavior by their employees or contractors. As the second anniversary of the Flight 847 incident approached, Marcus Rivera reflected on how his traumatic experience had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond his individual case or even the aviation industry. The young man who had sent 7 words in a text message describing his assault had become a nationally recognized advocate for civil rights, whose influence would likely extend throughout his career and beyond. But Marcus also understood that institutional change required ongoing vigilance, sustained effort, and continuous commitment rather than one-time reforms or temporary attention to civil rights issues. The reforms we've achieved are significant and meaningful, but they're not permanent or guaranteed. Marcus explained during his commencement address at Columbia University, where he graduated summa cum laude with a degree in public policy and civil rights law. Every generation has to recommit to protecting civil rights, and expanding opportunities for dignity and inclusion. The work is never finished because discrimination constantly evolves, adapts, and finds new ways to operate within changing social and legal environments. Marcus's post-graduation plans reflected his commitment to continuing the work that had begun with his traumatic experience on Flight 847. He had been accepted to Harvard Law School, with plans to specialize in civil rights law and institutional reform. But he had deferred enrollment for a year to work as a policy fellow with the ACLU's Racial Justice Program. Marcus Rivera is heading to Harvard Law School to become a civil rights attorney. But first, he's spending a year fighting for justice with the ACLU. From being slapped for sitting in first class to becoming one of America's future civil rights leaders, this is what transformation looks like. Comment, future leader, and subscribe, because this young man will change America. The fellowship would allow Marcus to continue his work on transportation equity while gaining practical experience in policy development, legal advocacy, and community organizing that would prepare him for a lifetime of civil rights work. His long-term goal was to build a career that addressed systematic discrimination across multiple sectors of American society, using the lessons learned from aviation reform to create comprehensive change in housing, employment, education, healthcare, and criminal justice. As Marcus boarded his first flight as a Columbia University graduate, traveling from New York to Washington for his ACLU fellowship orientation, he was greeted by name by the Skyline Airways crew and escorted to seat 1B, with the same courtesy and respect extended to every passenger. The contrast with his experience 2 years earlier was complete and gratifying. But Marcus understood that his comfortable treatment was partly due to his public profile and the ongoing scrutiny of airline operations by federal regulators, civil rights organizations, and advocacy groups. The real test of comprehensive reform was how airlines treated passengers who lacked his visibility resources and family support people who couldn't trigger congressional hearings or federal investigations when they experienced discrimination. The statistical evidence suggested that reforms were protecting those passengers as well, but Marcus knew that vigilance and ongoing advocacy would be required to maintain and strengthen those protections over time. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Marcus opened his laptop and began working on a law review article examining the effectiveness of the comprehensive reforms triggered by his experience. The preliminary data was encouraging discrimination, was decreasing across multiple measures, complaint resolution was improving substantially, and passenger satisfaction was increasing among all demographic groups. But the article also identified areas where additional reform was needed and ongoing challenges that required sustained attention. Some airlines remained more committed to meaningful change than others. Federal oversight was inconsistent across different regions and employee groups, and the broader challenge of addressing unconscious bias in customer service interactions required continuous innovation and improvement. The Flight 847 incident had demonstrated that individual courage and family support could create powerful catalysts for systematic change. One person's refusal to accept injustice quietly had reshaped how an entire industry thought about customer service, civil rights, and institutional accountability. But sustaining that change required continued effort from advocates, regulators, industry leaders, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept discrimination as normal business practice or inevitable social friction. As Marcus worked on his article, he thought about the thousands of passengers who now traveled with greater dignity and security because of reforms triggered by his traumatic experience. He thought about the crew members who had been trained to recognize and prevent discriminatory behavior. He thought about the federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and policy advocates who continued working to strengthen passenger rights protections and civil rights enforcement. Most importantly, he thought about the young people who would never experience the humiliation and assault he had endured because institutional changes had made such treatment legally, professionally, and culturally unthinkable, rather than routine or acceptable. That transformation represented the real victory of Flight 847, not just individual accountability for past discrimination, but systematic prevention of future injustice that would protect human dignity for generations to come. The new beginnings were everywhere visible in countless daily interactions that collectively represented a revolution in how Americans treated each other in public spaces, workplace environments, and social institutions. And Marcus Rivera, the young man whose quiet dignity had catalyzed that revolution, was committed to ensuring that the changes created lasting protection for everyone who traveled through America's transportation systems and participated in American society. His traumatic experience had become a source of hope and transformation for millions of people who would never know his name, but would benefit from the institutional changes his courage had made possible and permanent. The crystal chandeliers of the National Press Club ballroom cast warm light over an audience that represented the breadth of American civil rights advocacy and institutional reform. Aviation executives sat alongside passenger rights attorneys. Congressional staffers shared tables with community activists. Flight attendants and pilots from multiple airlines listened intently as Marcus Rivera, now 19, and preparing for his second year at Harvard Law School, approached the podium to deliver the keynote address at the first annual Aviation Civil Rights Conference. The young man who had been slapped and humiliated for asserting his right to premium seating had become one of the nation's most influential voices on transportation equity and institutional accountability. But as Marcus looked out over the packed ballroom, he understood that his role was to articulate a vision of justice that extended far beyond his individual experience and even beyond the aviation industry itself. 2 years ago, I sent a text message to my father that changed how airlines treat passengers. Marcus began, his voice carrying the confidence that came from having testified before Congress, spoken at universities across the country, and advised federal agencies on civil rights policy and enforcement. Those 7 words triggered comprehensive reforms that have made air travel more dignified and inclusive for millions of Americans. But the real lesson of Flight 847 isn't about aviation. It's about how institutional change happens when people refuse to accept injustice as normal, and how individual courage can create catalysts for systematic transformation that protects millions of people who will never make headlines. 2 years ago, Marcus Rivera was just a teenager trying to sit in his assigned seat. Today, he's addressing the nation's top civil rights leaders about institutional change. If you believe young people can reshape America, comment. Young leaders change everything below, and subscribe, because his message will challenge how you think about your own power to create change. The audience included many who had played crucial roles in transforming the aviation industry following Patricia Hawkins' assault on Marcus. David Rivera sat at the head table, the CEO whose response to his son's humiliation had demonstrated how corporate leadership could drive meaningful reform rather than simply manage negative publicity or minimize legal exposure. Jennifer Torres, now Director of Passenger Rights Compliance for Skyline Airways, represented thousands of airline employees who had embraced new training and cultural standards that prioritized human dignity over discriminatory comfort for privileged passengers. But the most symbolically important attendee was Patricia Hawkins herself, the former flight attendant, whose criminal conviction for assaulting Marcus had become a watershed moment in passenger rights enforcement and civil rights law. Patricia's presence at the conference represented both personal redemption and institutional accountability, a recognition that meaningful reform required acknowledgement of past failures rather than simply promises of future improvement. Patricia Hawkins made the choice that ended her career and resulted in federal criminal conviction. Marcus continued looking directly at the woman whose actions had inadvertently catalyzed his transformation from victim to advocate. But that choice was enabled by institutional practices that had normalized discrimination against passengers who didn't fit certain demographic expectations for decades. Her individual accountability was important and necessary, but the systematic reforms that followed her conviction have been truly transformational for American society. The statistical evidence supported Marcus's assessment of institutional change across multiple measures. The Aviation Civil Rights Commission's annual report, released just weeks earlier, documented dramatic improvements in passenger treatment across all major carriers and significant cultural shifts throughout the industry. Discrimination complaints had decreased by 73% since implementation of comprehensive reforms. Complaint resolution satisfaction rates exceeded 95% industry-wide. Most significantly, demographic analysis showed that premium seating had become substantially more diverse as discriminatory barriers were systematically eliminated and inclusive practices were implemented. The numbers don't lie. Discrimination complaints down 73%, satisfaction up to 95%, and first class is finally diverse. This is what real change looks like when it's measured and maintained. If you think data-driven civil rights progress gives hope, comment, progress measured, and subscribe, because numbers tell the truth that stories sometimes can't. Dr. Michael Thompson, the Georgetown University civil rights expert, who had advised federal investigators during their examination of aviation discrimination, presented research findings that demonstrated the scope and sustainability of institutional change that had occurred. What we're documenting isn't just behavioral compliance with new regulations or temporary responses to public pressure, Dr. Thompson explained during his presentation to the conference. We're seeing fundamental cultural transformation that has made discriminatory treatment of passengers professionally unacceptable and personally unthinkable for most airline employees. The reforms have become self-reinforcing because they're supported by comprehensive training, rigorous supervision, meaningful accountability, and peer pressure that makes bias a career-limiting behavior rather than a path to advancement. The cultural transformation was visible in countless small interactions that collectively represented a revolution in customer service standards throughout American transportation and hospitality industries. Flight attendants now greeted passengers of all backgrounds with genuine warmth rather than suspicious scrutiny based on appearance or assumptions about economic status. Gate agents processed boarding without making demographic assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. Crew members intervened immediately when they observed potentially discriminatory behavior rather than avoiding involvement in customer service issues. But perhaps most importantly, for long-term change, passengers themselves had become more aware of their rights, more willing to speak up when they witnessed discriminatory treatment, and more likely to hold airlines accountable through their purchasing decisions and public advocacy. The bystander intervention training programs implemented by airlines and advocacy organizations had created a cultural shift where silence in the face of injustice was no longer socially acceptable or professionally safe. Robert Chen, the technology journalist whose video documentation had triggered the viral response to Marcus's assault, had become one of the most effective advocates for bystander intervention and witness accountability in civil rights enforcement. His presentations at the conference focused on the legal and moral obligations of people who witnessed discriminatory behavior in any context, not just transportation settings. My video recording was legally important for prosecution and public accountability, Chen explained during his panel presentation. But my failure to intervene during the actual incident made me morally complicit in Marcus's humiliation and assault. The real reform isn't just training airline employees to avoid discrimination. It's training all of us to recognize our responsibility to challenge discrimination when we encounter it, rather than assuming someone else will take action or hoping the problem will resolve itself. Robert Chen just said what most people won't admit. Recording injustice doesn't make you a hero if you don't try to stop it. Real change happens when witnesses become defenders, not just documentarians. If you commit to being an active bystander who speaks up, comment, "I'll speak up," and subscribe, because change requires courage from all of us. Chen's advocacy had contributed to widespread adoption of bystander intervention training in workplaces, schools, and community organizations across the country. The programs taught people how to recognize discriminatory behavior safely, intervene in situations involving bias or harassment, and report incidents to appropriate authorities without fear of retaliation. Airlines had made such training mandatory for all employees, while many carriers also provided voluntary programs for passengers who wanted to learn how to respond effectively to discrimination they might witness during travel. The legislative impact of Flight 847 had extended far beyond aviation to strengthen civil rights protections across multiple sectors of American society. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had sponsored the original Aviation Civil Rights Act, used the conference as an opportunity to announce expanded legislation that would apply similar protections and accountability measures to hotels, restaurants, retail establishments, and other public accommodations. The Marcus Rivera incident demonstrated conclusively that discrimination often hides behind professional facades and customer service protocols, Senator Warren explained during her keynote address to the packed ballroom. "We need comprehensive civil rights enforcement that recognizes how institutional bias operates in modern America through coded language, selective enforcement of policies, cultural assumptions about who belongs where, and the systematic exclusion of people from spaces they have every right to occupy." The Marcus Rivera Civil Rights Enhancement Act, which Senator Warren had introduced during the conference, would establish federal funding for bias training in all industries serving the public, create independent compliance officers with authority to investigate discrimination complaints, and strengthen penalties for businesses that failed to address discriminatory behavior by their employees or contractors. But the most innovative aspect of the proposed legislation was its focus on bystander obligations and institutional accountability that went beyond individual discrimination to address systematic enablement of bias. The bill would establish comprehensive legal protections for employees who reported discriminatory behavior, require businesses to provide bystander intervention training, and create institutional liability for organizations that ignored or enabled discrimination by their personnel. Civil rights protection cannot depend solely on the courage of individual victims or the willingness of discriminators to reform themselves, Senator Warren explained. "We need institutional structures that make it safe and expected for witnesses to speak up legally, required for employees to report problems, and financially devastating for organizations to ignore bias before it escalates to assault, humiliation, or civil rights violations." Senator Warren just proposed making bystander intervention legally required, not just morally expected. Imagine if staying silent when you witness discrimination became a crime, revolutionary, necessary. Both. Comment your thoughts and subscribe, because this could change how American society handles injustice. The business community's response to the proposed legislation reflected how dramatically the Flight 847 incident had changed corporate attitudes towards civil rights compliance and institutional accountability. Rather than opposing expanded protections as burdensome regulation that would increase costs and legal liability, many industry associations endorsed the reforms as beneficial for customer relations, employee satisfaction, and long-term profitability. David Rivera, speaking on behalf of the Aviation Industry Civil Rights Coalition, articulated the business case for proactive civil rights compliance that had emerged from the comprehensive reforms his company had pioneered. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong and legally dangerous. It's economically destructive and strategically stupid, Rivera explained during his panel presentation. When customers feel unwelcome or disrespected, they take their business elsewhere and share their negative experiences widely through social media. When employees witness discriminatory behavior without meaningful consequences, they lose respect for leadership and organizational values. When companies develop reputations for bias, they struggle to attract diverse talent, loyal customers, and ethical investors. Rivera's analysis was supported by comprehensive economic research, showing that airlines with strong civil rights compliance programs consistently outperformed competitors across multiple financial metrics. Customer satisfaction scores, employee retention rates, stock price performance, and brand reputation all correlated positively with measures of inclusive customer service and systematic bias prevention. But the economic benefits extended beyond individual companies to entire metropolitan areas and regional economies. Cities with reputations for inclusive transportation services attracted more business travelers, convention bookings, and tourism revenue. Airports that implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination programs experienced increased passenger traffic, reduced complaint resolution costs, and improved relationships with federal regulators and oversight agencies. The international impact of American aviation reforms had been equally significant and far-reaching. The European Union had adopted similar passenger rights protections, inspired by the Flight 847 incident and the comprehensive reforms it had generated. Asian airlines had implemented bias training programs based on American models and legal frameworks. International aviation organizations were developing global standards for civil rights compliance that reflected lessons learned from Marcus Rivera's experience and the institutional changes it had created. What happened on Flight 847 became a catalyst for worldwide examination of how transportation systems treat passengers from marginalized communities, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, director of the International Transportation Equity Institute. The reforms implemented in American aviation are now being studied and adapted by countries around the world as examples of how institutional accountability can drive meaningful change when political will, legal enforcement, and public pressure align effectively. The Flight 847 incident didn't just change American aviation, it's reshaping how airlines treat passengers globally. One teenager's dignity became a worldwide movement for civil rights. If you think American leadership in human rights matters, comment American leadership and subscribe because our values are spreading worldwide. As the conference concluded with Marcus Rivera's closing remarks, the young civil rights advocate reflected on how his traumatic experience had generated changes that extended far beyond his individual case, the aviation industry, or even American society. The assault he had experienced in Seat 1B had become a symbol of discrimination that millions of people across the globe recognized and opposed. The dignity he had maintained while being humiliated had inspired others to stand up for their own rights and the rights of people they witnessed being mistreated. The text message I sent from Seat 32F wasn't just about my individual experience of discrimination and assault. Marcus explained to the audience of advocates, industry leaders, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across the country to attend the conference. It was about systematic problems that affected millions of travelers who didn't have the resources, platform, or family support to seek accountability through federal courts and congressional hearings. The reforms we've achieved protect those passengers as much as they protect me, and they'll protect passengers who haven't even been born yet. But Marcus also understood that institutional change required ongoing vigilance, sustained effort, and continuous commitment, rather than one-time victories or temporary reforms that could be reversed when public attention moved elsewhere. The Aviation Civil Rights Commission continued to identify problems that needed attention across multiple carriers and industry sectors. Some airlines remained more committed to meaningful reform than others, and the broader challenge of addressing discrimination in American society extended far beyond transportation into every sector where people interacted across lines of race, ethnicity, religion, economic status, and social background. The work we've accomplished in aviation demonstrates that institutional change is absolutely possible when people refuse to accept injustice as normal. Marcus continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into systematic social change. But it also shows that such change requires constant effort, ongoing accountability, sustained public pressure, and the recognition that civil rights protection is everyone's responsibility, not just the burden of those who experience discrimination directly. As attendees prepared to leave the conference and return to their work in advocacy, policy development, and industry reform, Marcus offered a challenge that reflected his own commitment to continuing the fight for dignity and inclusion that had begun with his traumatic experience on Flight 847. Every person in this room has witnessed discrimination in some form, whether in transportation, housing, employment, education, healthcare, or public accommodations. The question isn't whether bias exists in American society, because we all know it does. The question is whether we're willing to challenge it consistently when we encounter it, rather than hoping someone else will take responsibility or assuming the problem will solve itself. Patricia Hawkins, who had listened to the entire conference from a table in the back of the ballroom, approached Marcus during the reception that followed his closing remarks. The former flight attendant, who had lost her career freedom and reputation as a result of assaulting him, now worked as a community advocate, helping other people understand and overcome their own biases through education and personal transformation. Marcus, I want you to know that your dignity, in the face of my ignorance and cruelty, taught me more about civil rights than 25 years of corporate training ever did. Patricia said, her voice carrying the humility that came from having lost everything due to discriminatory behavior she had previously considered professional and appropriate. I can't undo what I did to you, but I can work every day to ensure that other people learn from my mistakes without having to make them themselves or hurt innocent people the way I hurt you. This moment between Marcus and Patricia shows the power of accountability, forgiveness, and redemption. The person who assaulted him became part of the solution. That's what healing looks like when justice includes restoration, not just punishment. Comment: healing and justice. If this moves you, and subscribe, because transformation is possible for everyone. Marcus shook Patricia's hand with the grace that had carried him through the most difficult experience of his young life, recognizing that her transformation from perpetrator to advocate represented the kind of personal accountability that made institutional change both possible and sustainable. Your willingness to acknowledge what you did, accept responsibility for the harm you caused, and work to prevent others from following your path is exactly what meaningful reform requires, Marcus replied. Individual accountability combined with systematic change, personal transformation combined with institutional reform. That's how we create lasting protection for civil rights that survives changes in leadership, public attention, and political priorities. As Marcus prepared to return to Harvard Law School for his second year of studies, he carried with him the knowledge that his experience on Flight 847 had generated changes that would protect millions of passengers, travelers, and ordinary citizens for decades to come. The young man whose dignity had been assaulted for asserting his right to premium seating had become a permanent catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond aviation to every sector of American society where discrimination threatened human dignity and civil rights. The lasting impact of Flight 847 was visible not just in policy changes, legal reforms, and statistical improvements, but in countless daily interactions where people treated each other with respect rather than suspicion, where witnesses spoke up rather than remained silent, where institutions prioritized inclusion rather than exclusion. 1 year later, the revolution in passenger rights that began with 7 words in a text message had become a permanent feature of American transportation, a model for civil rights enforcement in other industries, and a reminder that individual courage could create catalysts for systematic change that protected human dignity for generations. The work continued with every flight, every passenger interaction, every opportunity to choose dignity over discrimination. And Marcus Rivera, the young man whose quiet strength had started it all, remained committed to ensuring that the protection of human dignity stayed at the center of every policy, every training program, and every moment where power met vulnerability in American society. Justice had been served not through revenge, but through the kind of systematic change that made injustice impossible rather than merely punishable. The text message had been sent, the reforms had been implemented, the culture had been transformed, and the lasting impact would endure for generations of travelers who would never experience the humiliation that had made Flight 847 a watershed moment in American civil rights history. From a slap in first class to a movement that changed America, Marcus Rivera's story proves that courage, dignity, and the refusal to accept injustice can transform entire industries and reshape society. If you've ever been treated unfairly because of who you are, this story is for you. If you've ever witnessed discrimination and stayed silent, let Marcus Rivera's dignity inspire you to speak up next time. And if you believe that every person deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or background, share this story and subscribe to our channel. The fight for civil rights is never finished, and it needs voices like yours. What would you have done if you were on Flight 847 that day? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue building a world where everyone's dignity is protected. Remember, justice isn't about revenge. It's about progress. And progress starts with each of us refusing to accept discrimination as normal. Subscribe if you believe in dignity for everyone. Comment if this story changed how you think about speaking up. Share if you want others to know that individual courage can change the world. Justice doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it walks quietly down the aisle, calm and unstoppable, transforming everything in its path.